what Apple's done, because this tweet was in reference to the Vision Pro. This was kind of the first, I would call, consumer observed device.
We're comparing internally to like a concept modality of what a wow effect is.
We're not going to sell, in all likelihood, 100 million Quest Pros in the next 3 years, right? Like, I just don't think it's likely. Meta is trying to jump 5 steps ahead, I think, at once, right? Because I think, like, going from, hey, we're computing in these 2D planes, we're doing all these sorts of things.
Is that going to be the type of direction either of these ecosystems are going to allow? If no, why not? And if yes, when?
From a concept perspective, in terms of what they're all trying to do, is they're trying to basically abstract away the actual analog input layer to a computer.
Yeah, that technology just comes. And it's a very simple reality that it doesn't. It's built. And like, there's no future, there's no past, like it's all in the now.
AR glasses are just going to come. The cure cancer is just going to come, right?
No.
And it's like, no, so there's somebody that has to actually decide, like, no, like I have to make it happen, right? Like I have to contribute to that.
So welcome to the second episode of Bend Reality, where I talk with founders in the VR space, XR space, where they're bending the reality to create new products. And you're doing it in like the most important place, which is the resources and financing. So my guest is Arian Ghasghai. Arian is the managing partner at Earthling VC, where they invest in pre-seed AI, AR, VR, and robotics companies. Previously, he was an applied machine learning engineer at Meta, working on spatial interface systems supporting AR, VR applications, which later became Meta Reality Labs. From my limited interaction with you on Twitter and through like a mutual friend, I've gotten the impression that like Arian's a deep thinker, straight to the point, investor, builder, and an optimist. So I want to jump straight to something you tweeted about a week ago.
Let's do it.
Can I read it?
Thanks for that nice intro. I'm very, very flattering. Like I'm very I'm glad a lot of what I try to do comes across that way. So I'm glad that resonates. So thanks for that.
It's coming out very positive. Very positive, and it's coming out that whatever you're doing it because you want to see this industry thrive.
100%.
And it's coming from a deep place. A lot of like frustrations I see you voicing like are ones that I'm seeing as well, and like both of us have been like the space like for a long while, right? Like I've been like for like about a decade, but same with you, and they're real issues. So you're coming from like a no bull place, which I love, and like straight to the point, no fluff. Like even your Substack, right? I was reading it, and it's like just boom to the point. Like no like I hate the like intros. So I'm gonna get into.
I'm glad that's exactly what I try to do. So I'm glad that comes across.
Comes across very well. So I'm thankful for that. I'm gonna jump into one of your tweets. Yeah.
Yep. Let's do it.
Well, you tweeted VR isn't a console; it's a progression in the modality of computing. This is the year that will become obvious. In 2009, web-based businesses expanded to mobile interfaces. In 2024, in earnest, web mobile businesses will expand to spatial interfaces. So can you explain a little, like what you mean here?
Yeah, I think there are a few layers to this, right? And so I think the first thing is just starting like at a very first principles level, like what is the point of VR anyway? Like why is AR, VR, whatever you call it, right, relevant? And it just starts, I think, at the first principles of we're humans, we experience the world in 3D, right? And I think we've been conditioned to, because of technical limitation, experience it in this kind of 2D plane that we're still engaging in right now. But now we're sort of breaking through that barrier, and that extension of our physical environments actually becomes possible computing. I think that just naturally opened up a lot of opportunity that wasn't viable before. I think that's just like the base layer to all of this, right? Now, in a more practical sense, for example, this like on the console part, um, I think to date, right, a lot of people, for example, one of the critiques I would say of not necessarily within the VR community, but from outside of it was, well, the Quest is effectively like, which of course is the biggest VR ecosystem, is a gaming platform, right? Effectively it is called like a console. Like PS5, like it's more in the realm of the PS5 than it is the realm of the iPhone, for example. Um, and so what that actually implies, right, that it's actually a technology that's fairly disjointed from your everyday dealings for all intents and purposes, and just kind of how you go through the world. Which I think is like just a false impression. Like perhaps the current rendition of it, because we're still, I think, very early on the adoption curve of this, even to some extent the technical curve, which I think Apple's kind of not pushed forward. But um, that uh, it creates this impression, I think, that it's still disjointed, even though that's not actually true, right? That's not where this is going. And so that I think is an important thing to kind of realize. And I think what Apple's done, because this tweet was in reference to the Vision Pro, this was kind of the first I would call, consumer observed device. Because there have been interesting devices in the past, but like the
Consumer
normie is not looking
observed.
at. Yeah, I would say that like the general public is actually looking at it, right? Like paying attention to what it's doing, because there've always been a lot of very interesting headsets over the years, like the Varjos and stuff, right, of the world. But you ask a normie about it, nobody has a clue, right? Everybody knows what the Vision Pro is by now, and so that's just obviously the Apple effect. But so it's the first real like headset at that scale that I think is really proving out. Not like, wait a minute, there's a completely different way that you can compute now, and it is very integrated into our actual physical environment and all of that. And so I think that what the Vision Pro has done, it's really been the first headset to prove out this concept of, this is just the advancement of the computing that we already know, again, into our more natural environment, which previously was impossible, than any prior device. Like again, like us that have been into space for a long time, like we could sit here, maybe discern, okay, this is where the Quest is trying to go, right? And to some extent, you could argue it's trying to go into a similar direction of,
Yeah.
kind of an all-encompassing computing device that does interface with our physical environment, whatever. Apple, I think, is the first company to really ship it and really drive that point home that everybody kind of understands it. Because I think that's one of the big fallouts, even over the last week, that I've seen with the Vision Pro, is that love it or hate it, people are understanding that, like, computing this way is a thing. And so they're the first ones to do that. And so I think that's sort of where this progression of, what did I say? What, like the progression of modalities of how you
The
compute,
modality, yeah.
right? That's where that sort of comes in. That it's like, the Vision Pro is really the first one to show that, like, this is actually progression from the phone, right? Because, basically what the Vision Pro does is it just reshapes what you're already doing on your MacBook and your iPhone to some extent, right? And so that really, I think, drives that point home. And I think that last point is, if we go back in terms of, 2009 consumer internet, right? Companies moved from web to both web and mobile. Right now, I'm saying, hey, we're going to have web, mobile, spatial. That kind of comes from two. That kind of comes from two directions, right? From one hand, it just comes from, hey, this is available now, and it's just a new competency that exists that you can tack services onto, just like the phone, right? Because there's like, for example, an app like Instagram would have never existed if it wasn't for a phone, for example. It was something uniquely enabled by the fact that you have this mobile camera that's effectively connected to the internet. That enabled somebody to build an app like that. We're going to have a similar progression, I think, just on the spatial side, because again, new modality, new canvas to work in is going to create new opportunity. There'll be a lot of things we could talk about, like that's going to happen there and is already happening there. Um, but on the flip side, it's also, if you look at it sheerly from a computing stack, it's a TAM thing, right? Because one of the beautiful things with the Vision Pro, for example, the Quest doesn't have, is this vertical integration with the Apple stack, right? And so, right now, right, like all of us have, like a MacBook, an iPhone, one of us will have an Apple Watch. They're all like vertically integrated with each other. Um, and so now you're just throwing the Vision Pro on top of that, right? And so just by definition, you're throwing another kind of end user device into that stack. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen necessarily quickly, but you're kind of seeing it with the watch a little bit, right? We're getting, I think, more like it's kind of an underutilized platform, but you are seeing things that are being able by the watch, so they can tie into the whole stack. And you're just gonna have the Vision Pro that now tacks onto that as well, right? Where, hey, this is just a different platform we can offer our services on. And so by definition, I think that's just something that the Apple ecosystem will facilitate. Um, but yeah, so those are kind of the two things. I hopefully that was enough meat around the bone there.
I
Sort of
think it is.
explain.
So
Yeah.
um, what I'm getting at, what I'm understanding is that um, there's a whole shift that happened in 2007 when like iPhone was introduced, and now Apple defining it as a spatial computing interface is anchoring that shift to a spatial computing interface
Yep.
that we've so long fought for, in a sense. Um, and
Yeah.
it's interesting you're marking it with the Apple anchor, but I want to ask it like as a one layered question, and then I'll let you continue. Um, is mm, when iPhone was introduced, um, it was a completely new type of like a medium, right?
Yep.
As in the digital layer was not so deeply woven into our daily lives, and it became so with the iPhone, where it's you're carrying with you. Like you, we had phones before that, right? But it was a phone. It wasn't a digital layer. Now with the iPhone, that became your first digital like foray foray into that land, right? So and we're kind of like trying to do same kind of like justification and waiting for that same kind of wow with like VR, and we've been waiting for a while, and like with Oculus it got introduced, right? Then with Meta, so we had like multiple inflection points. Now with the Vision Pro, but are we like setting up ourselves for failure in the sense of like we're comparing internally to like concept modality of what a wow effect is, where
Yeah.
in reality this is wow, but since like it's with the like we have so many innovations coming like um and like there's been so many inflection points of VR that is that like hindering progress, do you think?
Um.
Of like to go back
So
to your
I,
point like, of building onto the stack, because like as you were saying, like
yeah.
initially like there's a it's adding the Apple like a watch stack, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
time for developers to start making it. It's still not like the next thing. Same with like
Yeah.
spatial. um,
Right. Yeah. I think sort of to look at like a very macro, like from a macro view, your question. I think one of there are a few problems that I think the public perception of VR has been suffering under. And I think one of the really big, and I think this is an important point to also emphasize, even with the Vision Pro, as much as I'm lauding it right now. I think there are definitely drawbacks to it, but overall, I think it's a good thing. But one thing I definitely want to make clear, sort of if you go from a macro view on like why is VR often perceived many ways it is, because you talk to an average person, they would tell you that to some extent VR is failure, right? And
mhm.
primarily because it was promised as the succession to the iPhone, right, or to the smartphone for all intents and purposes. That's often how it was labeled. And obviously, it hasn't lived up anywhere near to that, but just based surely on unit sales and general adoption, all of that at this point, right? So I think that was a bad analogy from the beginning, right, which sort of set up to failure because I don't think this was ever gonna scale that way, right?
Mhm, mhm,
I personally always use the smartwatch analogy a little bit more. Some people that I think are good thinkers in this space have used the PC analogy in terms of looking at the adoption curve. Um, but so that sort of idea that like this modality is kind of the natural successor to the smartphone, and as such, we should expect a similar kind of adoption curve is nonsense. I mean, even now, I think some people still fall into this fallacy. Like, I've had a few people reply to my tweets over the last few days saying, because I've sort of think a lot about how much sense does it make for certain companies, or that, let's say, if they're building for the Quest, or if they're just generally trying to get into the space, to put all of their eggs in the Vision Pro basket right now with where everything is. And and so I've had a lot of people sort of put comments like, Well, when you wanted to invest it in the first kind of in the first iPhone apps, right? When the iPhone came out in
Yeah,
2007,
yeah, yeah,
2008, whatever.
yeah. What
And my
responses are you
argument is,
getting?
what's that?
I'm saying, what responses are you getting there? It's interesting.
Well, it's not something that, but then, they usually do as a bit of a rhetorical question, right? But I'm like, it feels almost like a bit like a gotcha, right? But I'm always like, the Apple sold, I think, 13 million iPhones in its first year, if I'm not mistaken, or at least in 2008, I think it did. They're only expecting, against a rumor, this is not confirmed, but like, kind of the reliable analysts have said less than a million. So it could be 400 to 600,000, could be, maybe up to a million. But that's like, I mean, orders of magnitude less than what they sold the iPhone, right? And so I think that is sort of some indication that like we're not going to sell in all likelihood 100 million Quest Pros in the next 3 years, right? Like I just don't think it's likely. So the growth curve is different and all of that, right? It already goes like Apple's already conditioning us to think of this is not going to grow at the
Mm,
same pace of the iPhone. But maybe I'm wrong in 3 years. I don't know. But right now, there's no definitive. All the interpretations you can make on the numbers we actually have is that it's going to be slower, right? Um, so I'm actually nervous that there are even people pushing the same narrative that because it's an Apple product and because it's a brilliant Apple product, it's going to be on the same curve. So anyway, I think that's a macro point that's been to the detriment of the VR industry because I think it's suffered under this external pressure that it could never live up to anyway, and I don't think it will. So I think that's like really the cloud over all of this, right? And so what I think Apple did, which is smart in that regard. And at first, when I first saw the presentation WWDC when they announced the headset, I was me and I think a lot of other kind of, I would say, I don't want to call it OG VR people because I don't consider myself an OG at all, but people that have been in the space, like it
mm.
or drawn to the real issue aspect, we're kind of disappointed by the fact that, of course, most of it is, computing in the 2D planes that you're already familiar with, but more kind of geo anchored to your environment, for all intents and purposes, right? And the flexibility you get from that. I was initially critical of that because I felt like, well, it's kind of defeating the point of something that's genuinely spatial. Um, but with using it now and like thinking about that strategy, I actually don't think that was a bad idea because, and I think this is again where you're putting the adoption of these things kind of at the Meta approach versus the Apple approach. And it's
Can you
actually very
break that
interesting, I
down?
think, to watch.
What's like? I
Yeah.
want to have your perspective on how Meta is approaching it and how Apple is approaching it.
Yeah. So the big difference I think is because in my opinion, they're both kind of going towards the same end goal, which is this um effectively seamless integration of going from digital into real in like kind of like spectrums of experiences, right? They're digitally overlaid,
So
right?
they're
And so
both going
the
for
Vision Pro,
mixed reality play. Yes.
yeah, so basically you can go like into VR, you can be in MR, right? You can be completely passed through without anything, right? That this kind of this seamless device that where you can very seamlessly go to like varying spectrums of digital overlays for all intents and purposes, right? Now, so that of course covers full spectrum. What we now understand is like VR, and of course what we understand as AR and all that stuff. I think that's really where all of these things to some extent are leading to, at least the capability to do that. How it looks in 10, 20 years, we'll find out, right? But I think that's the aspiration. Now, Meta has taken the approach, and I think this is really like, it's really interesting to watch the dichotomy and also the interpretation of these things. Meta, I think, has gone from the perspective of, well, they bought Oculus, right? Oculus was a VR company. We're going to start approaching this from we're going to kind of master the fully immersive first and move the fully immersive more into the kind of mixed immersive, right? Which, of course, we're doing now with the Quest 3 and the Quest Pro, right? They're sort of trying to come from that end into the kind of the middle ground. Apple, I think, is taking it from the total other side. Apple's basically so basically, like to summarize Meta before I go to Apple,
Yeah. Can you
I
summarize
think Meta.
Meta's? Yeah.
What's that?
Can you yeah summarize Meta's approach? Yeah.
Meta basically with all doing that, I think what Meta is trying to do is if we're here on the like let's say general public understanding of let's call it 3D spatial computing, whatever you want to call it. Meta is trying to jump 5 steps ahead, I think at once,
Mm.
right? Because I think like going from hey, we're computing in these 2D planes, we're doing all these sorts of things, to hey, you're kind of this avatarized thing, low poly in some fully digital environments. while it works very well, for example, for kids and like the Roblox generation, all that, of course, with the power users of the Quest right now for the most part, it's a really far jump for most people, right? They don't
Mm,
understand it. Like they don't understand, like, you and I probably understand better what Meta's actually trying to do with this, right? What they're trying to prove out and build towards, right? Most people probably don't because it's just too big of a jump credit from one thing. Apple, I think, is taking the reverse approach. Now, Apple has basically said with the way that they laid out the UI UX of the Vision Pro, and even some of the limitations that they built into it, is we're just going to take everything that's already familiar to you, right? The apps that you know, the UI UX that you know from the iPhone and any kind of other Apple device, and just put it in a different modality. Right now, the only difference is you're taking everything you're putting in three. So really, Apple's actually only asking users to take one jump, like kind of one
mm,
step into the future. And I think the reason that that's free, that's just easier for most consumers to understand, right? And so I still fully expect that over time, Apple will probably start to get a little bit more hardcore on really leveraging what you can do in the actual spatial element of it. Because I think if there's one thing that stood out to me, I have the Vision Pro now for, since it came out last week, or I guess 8 days ago now as we're talking here. I've used it multiple hours a day. I have to say I'm very impressed with it, but I've
you're
almost
already
done
a
nothing inherent.
power user of 8 days.
But
Yeah.
this is the interesting
Yeah.
part, right? And this speaks exactly to that point, is that I power used it more as a replacement for my laptop than for my quests, right? Um, so I primarily use it, for example, to mirror my computer screen because it's just nicer, it's higher fidelity, it's huge, right? It's just more fun to work with. I've used it to watch sports, right? I've used it to basically as an entertainment work machine. I haven't really done anything like all I've done is demo some of the spatial apps that they have, right? Some of the MR, like, what is it, like spatial
Mm,
paint and Jig Space. I've played with these things, but it really doesn't have a dense content library at all for things that we would, of course, call, MR or VR or whatever. Um, and I think like over time, Apple will probably start to lean more into that, right? And like also now with them putting it out, there's a canvas for developers to come up with these things. But I don't feel it was accidental that the first step that they took was to put out a device that inherently is more just designed to put your MacBook into a different modality for all. It's a more immersive modality, but you're doing the same stuff in it. And I think that was very deliberate because more consumers understand it. I think part of the reason that, apart from just being an Apple product, about why so many consumers are so amped about the Vision Pro, because the reception, I think, generally speaking, has been very positive so far, is that, where it's like, it's just easy to understand and it feels very good. Whereas the Quest, of course, and again, I work with Meta, so I understand how they think about things, not just
mm,
not just in this VR context, but generally how they think about how to build products. I get what they're trying to do, but the thing that they don't understand is that most people don't understand that, and they're not going to
mm,
understand it. It's just
mm,
Apple took a much more kind of conservative approach, and I think that's why they're. That's why also back to the initial thing about it starts in 2024 is not because it's, again, I don't think that the Vision Pro actually does anything like, yes, it's a great piece of hardware, or it's a better piece of hardware than the Quest 3, but it's not inherently more competent, I guess you could say, than a Quest 3 or Quest Pro, or like, there are not that many experiences that there's certain things you can do on it that you can't do with a Quest, right? But a lot of things you can. But most people never understood that because of how the product, the Quest was positioned. I say 2024 because I think this is the year that actually most, I would call, quote unquote, tech normies uh, actually understand this, and that's because Apple took that small step, not that big step.
I think your explanation has been the cleanest I've heard. It's like this was something new to me too. As in, I knew Apple's mode, which was like taking things that exist and polishing the like hell out of it.
Yeah,
That's been
totally.
their like mode for like core for everything, and they've been doing it
Yep.
really really well. Like I guess that's more of like who they are as a company. Like I was listening to the Lex Friedman podcast with Jeff Bezos, and like something interesting he said was like, like we wanted to be a customer service company, not like logistics, Amazon, nothing. But we're like when people start like looking at us later on, they would want to copy our customer service. Doesn't matter what industry you're from, right? Like defense, education, doesn't matter what company you're building, but that's their mode. It's customer service. Apple's
Yeah.
is that polish. But I hadn't heard uh, someone describe Meta's philosophy,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. Like there's a and I see that they both need to exist because just one won't push the envelope. There's like this Indian mathematician Ramunajan. Um, he was like known for like coming up with theorems and then like not giving any explanation why they exist, and then
Yeah.
like people would then like sit and work and then like write the equations that it took to get to that equation, and like
Yeah.
then they would understand like the jump, but like he would never explain
Right.
like how he got to the jump. But
Right.
that's like extreme pushes the envelope, right? Like now it says
Yeah.
in like the human like collective consciousness, now it says
If
this is this is
if
available, this is possible. So it's a nice like a tension play. um,
I actually think, to your point, you brought up an interesting thing that I want to pick up on, which is, kind of what you just talked about with, like, well, Amazon's kind of moat is, the customer service, Apple's is the polish, right? I would kind of get the same idea, but usually always say like design, UI, UX is really like their moats, right? Innovating that is just what they're kind of, they lead the league in. Um, and Meta's, and I think this is another important thing to the new Mac OS is doing that with the, see, I get the emoji,
it's
it's
good.
funny.
We,
But
we need a lot of that in XR.
yeah, but so Meta's mode, and I think this is something that some people talk about, but it's perhaps not as pronounced, is scaling. They're really good at taking things that work and just like scaling the crap out of it and putting it in more people's
Mm,
hands than anybody else. Right? They're really, really good at that. On the flip side, they're really bad at innovating. And I don't just judge that from the perspective of the actual output of what they do necessarily. But that's also, again, for me, having been there for almost 5 years, just the company culture is not built towards that, right? That's just not how the company operates. It's not their superpower, right? So what's actually nice about the VR space now is I think you have two companies that are able to really lean into what their strengths are and their superpowers are in a harmonious way that pushes the entire industry forward. And I think that's actually a very exciting reality. You have Apple, which I think is because, we look at the Quest
mm,
pre-Apple, especially now post-Apple. I think one of the critiques, of course, that I definitely have, and you'll see me tweet about this a lot on Twitter, is that I think the UX and UI and the software on the Quest is absolutely terrible. And really, one of the biggest detriments to it, to the Quest ecosystem, is actually not the hardware, which I think, frankly, is good enough at this point. It's the software and the interface is awful that they can fix. What Apple's done is they've basically reinvented that now. Apple has set the standard for more or less what the UX and a VR headset's supposed to feel like. Of course, we can critique certain things, right? Like, that the inputs are very limited and all of that, and no controllers, etc. And that's a bit of a tangential conversation. But overall, like, I don't think anybody would argue that you put the Vision Pro on, that it doesn't feel better than a Quest from a UX perspective. Um, and so what's really nice now is Meta can look at that blueprint that Apple has put out, effectively copy it or just innovate off of it, or more or less integrate it into their own system, and actually make their thing better, make their UI better, their UX better. And of course, they're selling more headsets than anybody still, right? And so they can just, again, really, really benefit from that, right? And just really scale the crap out of that UX UI that Apple innovated. Apple, meanwhile, continues kind of pushing the envelope forward, right? And so who knows how long it's going to take the Vision Pro to really take like an actual sizable market share in terms of units on the market, right? Um, but I think that's a very, very good thing. And so, like, that for me right now, at least for 2024, is like a very harmonious counterbalance between Apple innovating and Meta scaling. So that for me is like, it makes actually the growth of this industry puts it in a very happy position right now, in my opinion. Maybe I end up being wrong, but that's kind of what I anticipate from the biggest thing that I singly anticipate from Apple entering the space in terms of like broader market impact, is that it's just going to really proliferate that like better feeling in the headset, that better UX in the headset. And that's a very good thing, because again, that's where Meta's been just very poor. And so they'll win for that as well. So if I was Meta, I'd be over the moon with Vision Pro, to be honest.
Apple innovating and Meta scaling. I like it. It's like it
That's what it is,
explains the dichotomy, explains the like philosophy. I never understood Metas.
I
Now
can tell you.
now I get it.
um,
Now it makes a lot of
Okay.
sense the way you're putting it, and like the reality is actually backing that up. Like with
And this is the important
yeah.
thing to understand, right? Like I worked, and not just I'm just not saying that from a conceptual perspective,
Mm.
right, or like outside of any sort of perspective. I'm saying this from, I worked at Meta RL for a number of years, so I saw how business got done there. And what
RL
the
is
incentives were.
Reality Labs, right?
Now, yeah.
Yeah.
I also got to talk to a few people that were working on Apple's program. So now I can't talk about Apple, how it was actually to work there firsthand because I didn't work there. But I can only talk about what are some of the consistent narratives that I've heard from people that were working there, and of course my personal firsthand experience working at Meta. And the reason Meta is good at scaling is because their company culture, in my opinion, is very marked by the ads ranking culture, which is what made the company extremely successful and profitable.
Mm.
So they're very, very geared towards short-term results for all intents and purposes. So like one of the annoyances that I had there is, we were asked to build very 0 to 1 systems. No IC on my team ever felt that we got enough time or space to just come up with it, right? Because there's a really kind of novel things that they asked us to do.
What's an IC?
The
Sorry,
question
Arian.
is, sorry, so independent contributors, so basically non-managers, like the engineers and stuff.
Okay.
Um, And we never really got the space and time to do some of the things that they asked us to do because the question was always like, well, can you demo this in like 2 months, right? We're like, well, we don't know, like, because, we don't even have data yet to build these the ML models and stuff. But, that's how the company cultures. It's very like kind of like now, which I
Mm.
think is a lot more conducive to incremental progress and scale and right more worried about like we have something that works that's just spread the quote unquote impact, which is the word they use a lot, is a lot easier than let's go very vertical on something that's more long term and hope it works, right? Um, so I felt at least in our org, we were never really given the space to do that, which is a company culture thing. And again, like I'm not going to criticize them for it because it's culture that also made them a very profitable, very successful company, right? It just means that they're going to excel at something and they might not be as good as certain other things, right? That's really just the outcome of that. Apple on again, from what I've heard from folks that work there, it was actually quite the opposite, where they were given a lot of time and space to come up with something that was agreed upon that we think this needs to be a feature built, just basically go figure it out. And take however long you need to do it, but just go, you have space, go do it. Again, I can't obviously, of course, corroborate that firsthand, but that's what I was told. But it also feels consistent, right? Because Apple can only ship the device that they did if I think they really had people that spent some serious time like innovating this, right, and putting this together, right? This is not like a quick turnover kind of thing. And I think that reflects, right? Like, for example, I think you'd even say like over the generations of the Quest, right? You could say, well, the hardware always got better, but did the UX really change that much? Like, let's say from like the Quest 1 to now the Quest 3, like, does it really feel that different in terms of when you put that up? To me personally, and I think that's reflective just again how the company works. So, um, and so now and because Meta is very kind of obsessed with de-risking everything, right? And so the good news for them is Apple has de-risked this whole new UX UI,
Uh,
right? And so basically they don't have to go and internally validate and have somebody build it and whatever to do that. They know it works. They can just copy it, right? For all intents and purposes. And so that I think is a good thing for them and very conducive to how they work. Now, I'm sure some people at Meta might listen to this get angry at me for saying all these things, but it's just that's the reality that I experienced when I was there. But and again, I think it plays into like what Meta's good at and what Apple's good at, which is a good thing. Again, it's like I think like all
I
the
think
stuff
it's
I like that I think sport. I don't think there's very competitive ecosystems.
a great thing. The way like you're painting it, it makes a lot of sense in my head. Like one is geared for like from like if you look at it from like a nature perspective, right? Like a biological perspective. One is like geared towards reproduction, and the other is like towards a more better organism for the environment. And both are important, right? Like
Pretty much.
if it
Yep.
doesn't replicate, it'll stop to be, and if it doesn't
Yeah.
continuously adapt as that single form in that environment, it stops to B. So both
Yeah,
are,
yeah.
yeah. Um,
I mean, I think it was needed, right? Because I've held this theory for a long time, which is why I was very happy about even when Apple just announced that they're going to ship this thing in what was it, last June, I think it was. That Meta itself can only push the ecosystem forward so much, right? And so, and I give them a lot of credit for what they've done so far, right? They've effectively willed the industry up to this point, which I give them a
they
ton
have
of credit
wielded, yeah.
for because they've taken a lot of flack for it, of course, from investors and outside observers and all that stuff, right? But Zuck kind of went and did it anyway, and so I think that to get the kind of industry up into that initial hump, right? Meta deserves all the credit in the world for it. But for I think for the industry to keep thriving, they were not they're going to have some other player that's going to have to come and help push the rock, right? And so Apple, there's nobody better than Apple to do that, right? And so I think Meta single-handedly, I think it had taken it as far as it could have gone.
Mm,
Now it's kind of the next era where things really push forward, kind of that next hump, I think. And so that's I think really the broader picture significance of Apple coming in. Um, and there are a lot of other reasons for that as well. I think particularly if we start getting down to the developer layer and stuff, like as complimentary as I can be of Meta and what they've done, and kind of grateful for what they've done to some extent. There are things that I think they participate in that are need disruption for all intents and purposes. And so again, having a kind of a competing quote unquote ecosystem that comes in is probably a good thing for that. Um, but again, even in the end of the day, everybody will win for that, right? But um, right now, I think we're in this harmonious state, right? Also for a few other reasons, right? Like, I don't think the initial demographic of the Vision Pro in any way infringes on the demographic that the Quest has done really well with, whether Meta likes that reality for the power user demographic is or not. Again, Meta can take a lot of that innovation. I think it's a good thing. Over time, might that start to converge? Yes, and then perhaps it starts to get a little bit more competitive, and you maybe really get more of that kind of iOS Android dichotomy going. But um, yeah, but for now, it's good, and I think a lot of the fallout for this is going to be quite good. I think for everybody in the industry. So both on the consumer side and I think crucially on the dev side, which I think is can often also be kind of a forgotten point. But yeah, it's very good. It's like I'm very excited, as you could hopefully hear.
yeah, it is. Me too, actually. Like to your point, like this, for example, right? This existed before, and Apple just took it, and made it so good. They did the same with like,
Yeah.
um, I remember they bought Spaces early on. I remember the Spaces startup. They were like one of the first to make it available to stream from a desktop VR environment to a Zoom call.
Yep.
Like they inspired me to do an app as well, like I tried for like a year, built like app called Knock Knock, for like
Yeah.
similar turned into like podcasting, but they bought Spaces, and I think their Spaces team worked on the personas and the
Mm.
FaceTime.
Oh,
That's what I'm guessing. And then uh, they, uh, what was that company they bought? Vivantana, Viarnium.
yeah.
That they,
VR Rana, something like this.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I
Viarana.
think.
And that was
Yeah. Yeah.
the dimming feature, right? That had it first, I think.
So
So
yeah, I
they,
think so. Because I know there's another VC out there from Triptych Capital in Canada. One of their general partners there was actually part of that acquisition. So I think he was at Apple for a while working on it. So
mhm.
he might be actually a really interesting guy for you to talk to because I think he's um, definitely more legit than me on both sides of the equation here. But yeah, so like I actually know a little bit from that background about Virana and that sort of thing, how they stuck around there to work on the Vision Pro.
Yeah, that's that. Intro me later. I'll ask for you for it. That'd be
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah, yeah,
Thing. Uh, yeah, there's so like I'm seeing that philosophy in like I used Division Pro briefly. Our friends Botox, and things that existed, they just took it and did it so well. Like just watching a movie, right? It's like that's
Indeed.
nothing new, but
It's
it's
not middle. No,
executed so well. It's so polished. I mean,
that's
yeah,
Apple.
yeah. There's quirks and stuff, right? And with that, I want to get into like um, one of the quirks being input. It's
Mhm.
I love how like they've just taken the mouse click and they're trying to own
Yep.
that in a 3D space and time as this.
100%.
And
Yep.
there's no
100%.
other hand interactions. Whereas to your point with
Yep.
like Meta, it's like everything possible. They've just taken this. It's just the click,
Yep.
and then like you can add a dimension to it by holding longer as like a right click. So that's the
Totally.
like main modus of operation, which
Yep.
I have a lot of like issues with. Like I love it, but it's not bringing that. It's not bringing that magic of like what I think would be possible of what it should look like in creating in VR. And then to your point, to like Meta's not doing that either. Like they've taken um, a very like Windows approach to it, right? Like the methodology of how Windows-based applications work is taken into like a VR space where it's just like things are as Windows. You have to jump from one app to another. There's like even typing is was horrible, and like things are like a laser pointer, right? Like it's like from it's the same kind of
Laser pointer really
reduction
bad.
from like thought to fingers, 10 fingers, then
Yeah.
to like two fingers, then to letters, which are also like agreed upon symbols. So it's like this like
Right.
offer is so thing. So there's I want to get your opinion on I've seen you tweet about like the killer app. And I'm leaning on the direction where the killer app is not a killer app. It's it's a combination of input and
Yeah.
the operating system. Like so we have like large language models for AI, right? I'm thinking we need a. I'm borrowing from Rabbit's CEO. He mentioned large action model. I think we can add
Mm.
an S there and say we need like a large spatial action model for XR.
Mm.
I don't know. I'm thinking like that's going to be the killer app where there's a interaction, creation, all in one in an appless environment. I want to get your because take on that. Like how are you imagining it?
I mean, I think quickly to the input thing, right? I mean, there's really two ways to spin that. I think you phrased it exactly well. So a complete simulation of what we already know with a mouse click or the tap on our touch screen on the iPhone, right? And this goes back to this familiarity perspective that it's taking an interface that we already basically understand, but just slightly changing the modality, right? Like, and so it's very effective for the context that if you're looking at the Vision Pro to be a device that's almost exclusively designed to be the next modality of your iPhone, if you want to put it that way, the next modality of your MacBook. It works really well for that. The problem is, of course, it's extremely limiting, particularly with what you can do in spatial environment, right? There are certain apps it's quite nice for, right? You know, like I tried Jig Space. I think it's a quite nice interface for Jig Space and kind of moving objects around and stuff. It's very intuitive. Well, you know, take like the Golf Plus guys, right? Golf Plus, of course, being, one of the most successful gaming titles, the golf game, of course, VR golf game on the Quest. You know, ask them about how they feel about the inputs, right? You know, and it's just like, you know, you basically you can't build a golf game with the Vision Pro inputs, right? It's too limiting, right? And there's no, obviously, of course, there's no developer access to building any controllers or anything like that, right? So you're too limited. So there's like on one side, it's great because it's intuitive, it's familiar. Anybody like I put my Vision Pro into to my mother and a friend so far. They all understood it very, very easily, a lot easier than the Quest, which is great, right? And again, these sorts of things matter, right? Because if you put it on for the first time, it's too complicated, you don't get it, you're not going to use it, right? So these things matter, but on the flip side, it's like I do ask the question about like what, like I almost say that to from a software perspective, in terms of what you can theoretically do, they're almost most of the things that you can do on the Vision Pro, you can do on the Quest 3. Not to say you can do it better. I think the things
Okay.
the AVP was designed to work better on the Vision Pro than the Quest 3, but they're able to do it. But there's certainly a lot of things you can do on the Quest 3 that you can't really do on the Vision Pro. Now, that's not really a critique. That's more of an analysis. Because again, I think Apple made it very clear from the beginning that like, we're not envisioning this as being a gaming headset, right? So it's like, it's subsequently designed as such. Um, but so that's just something I definitely wanna emphasize, that it's nice, but it is limiting, I think is sort of the thing with the inputs. As far as the killer apps go, I mean, I'm really thinking about it, right? And so I've seen, of course, VCs and a few other people propose apps that are going to be the quote unquote killer app, right? Where, most of the suggestions I've seen fall into what I just said earlier. Like, well, this isn't something that was actually enabled by the Vision Pro, right? Like this is some, for example, like virtual pets. I mentioned this on Twitter. Is one that I've seen pitched a lot or mentioned a lot over the last couple of weeks. And like, yes, to some extent, I do agree that probably somebody will do this and make a lot of money doing it. Now, I've been pitched this idea for the Quest 3 before, and there was no discernible problem with doing this on the Quest 3. In fact, I would argue it's even better on the Quest 3 because, if you look at like Tamagotchis before, they were mostly geared at like adolescents, right? Like those are the ones that are using the Quest 3. Like, I guess initially probably unlikely to use the Vision Pro to show you the price point. So I actually argue that even the Quest 3 is going to be a better device. So I'm like, sure, like maybe the Vision Pro got people to imagine these things, but um, these aren't ideas that are like unique or novel to that device, right? It's just novel to the medium, to that MR medium, right? And so, which is already kind of existing. So, like, what is uniquely possible on the Quest, on the Vision Pro? I've gotten a few interesting answers to this as I kind of crowdsourced it from Twitter, because again, there are a lot of builders that will just have better ideas than I do. Um, there are two up to this point. There are two ideas, or I would say concepts, that stuck out to me that were, and this goes a little bit into what you were saying actually. One side was the volumes idea, right? For example, that I can play like an MR game here, and I can have my YouTuber listen to my music over on that side, right? And that like that's just fundamentally not the way that the Quest ecosystem is designed to run, which is kind of what you alluded to earlier as well. I think, of course, that's an innovation that could happen, but at this point, fair enough, right? Like at this point, it's just not designed to work the way. That's not a specific experience, but it's a capability of the device, of course, right? The second thing, which I thought was a very astute point, and to be fair, I haven't gone and corroborated this, but I do think it's a valuable point, is that the Vision Pro just has a lot more ML capability, right? So it's a lot easier and viable to run powerful ML models on the edge on the Vision Pro, and there's just more performance in it. I like a lot more performance in it. And so that of course of itself is not a specific end application, right? But it does let you think, well, there are systems and models and all these things you could build that are natively on the device, which of course is an interesting backbone to a lot of downstream applications. I think so. That does sort of sum up, I think, into what you said, is this kind of like this all-encompassing model, right? That kind of sits kind of over all the individual applications. But I mean, as far as where my own conviction lies at this point, like I'm actually, to be perfectly honest, still trying to figure it out. I mean, we're 1 week into this device, so like I'm really trying to build clarity onto the question about what is a product that can be built for the Vision Pro. And again, like better UX and stuff aside, right? But like just more categorically, like from technical feasibility perspective, can be built for the Vision Pro that currently cannot be built for the Quest. Impossible, right? Now, again, these two are two examples of just building blocks, right? Because these aren't actually individual applications; these are building blocks of experiences, right? What are the downstream experiences from that? To be perfectly honest with you, I have no idea, right? Like at this point, I don't have a particular great conviction. I think there are things that will work, but there are also things that will work. There are also the same things that will probably work for Quest 3. So again, it's not a particularly novel innovation, or the AVP is not a particularly novel platform for that necessarily. So it's a very difficult it's a thing I'm trying to work through, to be honest. At this point in time, it's like, to be just very transparently, I don't have the answer to that right now. One thing I personally do think, though, and again, this is also something that works for the Quest 3, but like if I was building something, and maybe this answers the question slightly, one thing that I find really compelling about how the Vision Pro works and again, you kind of do this in the Quest 3 as well, and there are apps like this in the Quest 3 to be fair, is that, this is probably the best screen. Like, this is the only screen where you can really do stuff laying down. Because, like anything
Oh,
else, it's like you have a state monitor or something, right? Like, you have to look to the right, you kind of can't move, right? But this is the first time your body can actually be perpendicular and horizontal. And you can basically look up and have a whole experience kind of from you in that position without actually being very fairly stationary, but also mobile. And so I'm like, there's this app, for example, for the Quest 3, which I put Angel Check into a long time ago, um, called Pillow Social, which is very much designed on that same sort of insight.
oh,
But
I've
I
seen.
think, like, yeah, especially from using the Quest, from using the Vision Pro, I'm like, I feel like this is something that this modality can do that nothing else can do. You can build like probably very, very compelling, like, meditation apps or something like that, based on the insight of people will use this kind of laying down on their couch or something. Me personally, that's an insight I would explore because I think it's something very, very unique. And I do think just sheerly because of how the UX and the Vision Pro
Hmm.
works, I feel like it's better designed for that than the Quest Pro is to some extent. The Quest Pro, Quest 3, frankly, both of them are designed for. So me personally, I would look into something like that without having like a definitive idea of what the end app would look like. But I think that's kind of, for me personally, the insight of how these devices work that I think is very kind of unique and special, especially different from, existing monitors and stuff that we have that will work great in the Quest and the Quest and Vision Pro, both of them again. But um, just as a nugget, but that's kind of where a lot of my thought has been over the last week on potential applications.
Are we gonna see an applessness type of um, environment possible, like on either of this? Like,
Right.
will I be, do you think anytime soon on either of these ecosystems be able to make something where it can be in the middle? Let's say, like, for example, like a very simple example, a camera, right? That I can carry with me instead of it's in the app bucket, where I have, let's say, Twitter open. Um, I can bring this camera in front of my tweet, take a photo of it while I'm like playing golf. Um, so is that going to be okay? Two things. If you do know, um, is that going to be the type of direction either of these ecosystem are going to allow? Um, if no, why not? And if yes, when?
It's a really good, interesting. So if I just to make sure I understand your premise quickly. So when you said to play the golf, you mean VR golf or like real golf?
VR golf. Let's say I'm in the VR golf
Yeah,
application.
yeah,
I bring out my Twitter app in VR, and then I take out my camera app, and then take a photo of my tweet. It can be like an API call, and
yeah.
while I'm in the golf
Right,
field. So it's a play between three applications.
right, right. No, no. I totally get what you're saying. So what's interesting about the Vision Pro? I saw this interesting blog post the other day about basically designing for the Vision Pro by I think one of the founders of Puzzling Places, which I thought
Oh,
was really
Azat,
interesting. I shared on.
Azat or the other.
I think Shahriar was the guy's name. I
Okay.
think that wrote this, and he wrote a really interesting piece on this. And so I think he had a breakdown, which I think it's like if you put it in the show notes or like the whatever the description, it might be interesting to link it because I thought it was a really compelling read actually. Um, where he's basically talking about like the different like modalities of apps that you can build, right? Basically from like kind of MR to like kind of contained immersive. I forgot the exact terms that he uses, right? Like this kind of contained immersive environment and there's like all encompassing environment, right? And so um if we assume those like those kind of three tiers to exist that he talks about, what I think you're basically suggesting is that like can I run basically like almost like if you want to put it in web equivalents like an iframe of another app in kind of one of these all-encompassing, all-immersive apps. Um, I mean, again, without actually knowing kind of like what's under the hood for Apple, it would seem that that's feasible, and I think that would make for a very interesting experience. And I do feel like if we're looking 10, 15 years in the future, it would make to me that something that makes sense that you have different modalities of these apps that can interact with each other in some sort of way, or like you can have um, you know uh, these smaller contained apps with kind of as a like pseudo
And like
iframe, if you want
with
to.
baked in like predictability,
Yeah.
like an kind of like an action AI be built in as well.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where, like, I think if I'm looking 15 years in the future, it's something that at least I would like to see, and I would probably expect in some shape or form to see that level of like interactability. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen anytime soon, largely because my feeling is that this is just more an evolution of what Apple is currently already supporting, at least with the Vision Pro. And but the question being like, I'm not super convinced yet about how much commitment Apple has to the fully
Uh,
immersive. Um, because it's very clear that and again there could be very practical reasons that they want to do this. For example, like to minimize motion sickness, right? Because I think for Apple, for it would be a disaster, right? Let's say they supported like you can put Gorilla Tag hypothetically. Let's just say, or not even Gorilla Tag, but some let's say call a first person shooter into the Vision Pro, and you're running around your apartment, shooting or whatever. I don't know how you do it with the inputs, right? But I will just could say hypothetically, where of course a lot of people get motion sickness. It would be a disaster if like 50% of people buy Vision Pro play a game and get motion sick, but pay $3,500 to get motion sickness, right? So I think Apple definitely wanted to mitigate against that, and I think that's part of the reason why, like, as soon as you move or get up, right, like it breaks out of the fully immersive. Let's say you have the environment like drilled up all the way, right? Like I think these were all like clear design decisions that they made. And again, maybe it's practical just because it's like, wait, this is a way to mitigate motion sickness right now with where we are. It could also be that like they just don't see that from their perspective as being the future beyond kind of very niche use cases. um and so we don't really want to lean into it, right? And so that I think is the big question. I think for me personally it's too early to really say like you know where Apple sees this. I mean, you could maybe try to analyze some of the things that Tim Cook has said in the past about, augmented reality explicitly, right? Where, maybe some of the indication again goes towards, even though they call it spatial computing, but, you try to connect that together and say, well, they're more interested in the MR stuff for all intents and purposes than they are in VR. They're never really going to go deep down the VR direction. That would, of course, have implications on how these kind of systems get built, right? Um, so there are a lot of question marks, but I think kind of going forward into like where I personally see all this going in the long term, which is kind of like what I said before, this seamless blending and like going in and out of, kind of fully immersive to non-immersive environments, right? Is and kind of that spectrum in between is really where all this stuff is going to end up. Which implies like, a conversion of or convergence, sorry, of AR, VR, MR, all this stuff sort of converges into the same device. Um, whether Apple believes it, I don't know, right? And so, but that's if that's inevitably where it goes, I think we'll get to the scenario that you're describing. But I don't expect it to happen anytime soon.
will we see a like a Rabbit R1 type device for XR, where it's like a nice blend of hardware and like almost just one software layer?
I mean, so I'm going to ask you here to just for clarification, also for the audience that might listen to this, because like I've looked into the Rapid R1, I've
Yeah.
like watched the demo video and stuff. My personal interpretation, and again, maybe this is a very primitive interpretation, which is why I'll put it back to you first before I answer your question. Um, to me, it just seems like it's a device that you talk to that basically just instructs your phone to do certain things, is my understanding of it. So it's like a companion device for your phone that somehow is like, because like, let's say Siri on your iPhone's crap, it just layers this over your phone with a separate device and it does things. That's how I understood it. Maybe it's wrong. Like, to be honest, I didn't really get that taken by it, that I really dug deeper into it. So that might be my own ignorance here. But um, is that interpretation more or less correct of what it's doing?
I'm looking at it more of a like the reason it had to exist as a hardware device separate from the phone
Mm-hmm.
is in order to introduce the concept of no app, where it's
Right.
it's powered by Perplexity AI, right? and it's bringing that first layer of applessness, which I think is really
Yeah,
important
yeah, I'm,
for XR.
right. Right. I think what it's doing, right, and I think, and I put rabbit. So I agree with what you're saying, right? Like, and that's kind of a bit of my interpretation was as well, which is this general trend that I see, right? Which is, and I personally put the Vision Pro, like basically VR headsets, the R1, the Humane pin, like the AI pin, all this. I put all of this. I know that there's these semantics of AI wearables and VR headsets, they're semantically different, but I mean, in practice, I think it's the same thing, right? And from a concept perspective, in terms of what are they all trying to do, is they're trying to basically abstract away the actual analog input layer to a
Yeah,
computer and trying to make it more natural, right? Like, so the VR headsets are doing this more on a visual premise, right? Um, the R1 and the Humane pin and all these things, they're trying to do it a little bit more. Yeah, there's maybe like, for example, the Humane pin, of course, there's a bit of a computer vision element to it as well. But all the demos that they had were primarily geared on semantic linguistic understanding and then translating that into some sort of machine function, right? But also, it kind of goes into this like natural interfacing that's just not this kind of analog screen that we're used to. So it plays into the same trend, right? And so for me, that's why these technologies are all extremely convergent anyway, because like they're very basic examples, but like I'll give you one that we were sort of tasked to work on a little bit when I was at Meta, my team, my work, was like let's say you're walking on the streets and you see a coffee shop that let's say through AR glasses, because this was a glasses project, and you actually, to be honest, they demoed, I think, the early signs of this at Meta Connect last year, so you can see it in your Washington Square Park and stuff. But basically, the premise is, I can go with my glasses and see, like, okay, I see the store, right? I'm not inputting anything manually, right? It's just perceiving my actual natural perception as a human,
computing from the
and
head head
for
perspective.
right, from like its face would be like the AI glasses, right? Which are, of course, very futuristic at this point. But let's just look at it conceptually. I can look at this coffee shop, and through a combination of perceptive signal, right? So one is just my straight computer vision, right? Like in terms of like what my eyes are actually looking at as human. So I don't even put anything other than what I'm naturally doing. And then, in the back end, you have, of course, things, let's say like GPS and maybe some other signals that can then start to put together. Oh, you are looking at the Starbucks on Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. This, we could basically pin this down to a particular location, basically turn it into software. And then, you can, for example, naturally interact with it, right? You can look at it and be like, hey, give me the menu for this, right? And then, like, it can pull up the menu. And so you start to see that that's actually convergence of like what you do now is I'm standing at a place. Maybe I go to my Google Maps. I would click on that coffee shop I'm saying next to, and then I click on its website and I pull up its menu, right? And it's this very kind of analog process. And so a lot of these devices are really actually building the building blocks for, right? Is, hey, I can get to the same answer by just standing and perceiving my natural human inputs, right? So really all it's doing, and I'm just putting this like machine overlayer that feels very natural on top of it, that kind of basically puts by my perception on steroids, right? Really actually ties it to the internet to some extent. And so I think that's where all of these devices are going anyway. So to kind of
Mm,
answer your question, that was a very long-winded way to say that, like, I don't really think we need an explicit R1, so to speak, for VR, but I think like the natural direction of this entire, of all of these industries, right, is already going towards that anyway, right? Where all these things sort of come together into some sort of singular form factor. It's still a ways out. My personal take on that continues to be that I think, again, this is very subject to change, but that the kind of real first natural proof of concept of a device that's able to really embody all of these different elements that work together will be AR glasses. I think those are much further out than people think. There are always people sort of like, they're coming next year. Apple's going to release AR glasses. Like, no, like this stuff is much further out than you people think, because you can only beat physics so much, right? We're so out of laws of physics,
yeah, I think like
and these things are very hard
2030
to make.
earliest.
That's what I think, right? Because the thing that
Mm,
people, I think, don't have a lot of appreciation for is that, if there are no chips that are powerful enough that fit into that form factor without burning your face or not looking completely ridiculous, right? Like, and so And that's a physical limitation, right? So I always say we're a chip innovation away from AR glasses actually being a viable product. And who knows when that happens, right? So it's not imminent by any stretch of the imagination. But I think conceptually speaking, I think that's really where you start to see some of the convergence points of, a lot of this kind of like integrating with your environment, spatial aspect that the Vision Pro is doing, the app abstraction that you mentioned with something like the R1, the kind of hands-free interaction that it's similar to R1, but like you get from the AI pin, which is a device I personally don't like at all, but there are kernels of truth in it for sure. And that will probably culminate in AR glasses based on what I see today. I think, my opinion will probably change on that over years, but I consider all that stuff to be convergent as it is. It's just different starting points to what effectively is going to be the same ends.
Yeah, one point you made that was interesting that like I recently learned as well, like by being in reality, was like we have this conception. You're saying like we're a chip away, right? We at least I did. I had a conception like before, like getting into building these things, was like that technology just comes, and
Mm,
it's a very simple reality that it doesn't. It's built, and like
one,
there's there's no future, there's no past. Like it's all in the now, and it's like how we can put it together in the now. So
yep.
that concept was like it it's a very simple concept, but it came hard, and I think that's where like the general minds like everyone thinks that it's coming. It's not unless it's built.
100%. I think Peter Thiel even talks about that 0 to 1, right? Where he basically talks about, our, which is, I still think it's such a great mental framework where I think he has this like quadrant of, I forgot exactly how it describes it, but it's effectively like, views of the world or views of the future that people fall into, right? Where it's like optimist, pessimist, definite, indefinite, right? And so he has like, the indefinite pessimists are these people, right? Like the definite optimists are these people, um, so on and so forth, right? So he has like an explanation for each one. And so, if I recall correctly, he has, and I might be butchering some of the details, but I think the overarching point is what he means, where he talks about that we, in particular in the West, have a very indefinite, optimistic view
Mm,
of the world, where our expectation is better medicine is just going to come, the next iPhone is just going to come, right? Without, of course, acknowledging, and the indefinite part is that like they don't do anything about it, right? Like they're just, it's like I don't have to deal with it, right? It's kind of the mentality is just going to happen. Like I don't have to do it. Um, and so I mean he talks about that in 0 to 1, which I think is it's very true, right? And I think you can apply that to a lot of things. It's like AR glasses are just going to come, the cure to cancer is just going to come, right?
no.
Um, and it's like no, so there's somebody that has to actually decide, like no, like I have to make it happen, right? Like I have to contribute to that.
Yeah.
Which is, for example, why I have respect for people like Elon Musk. Like I don't necessarily love everything culturally about how he does things, but like I do definitely respect the fact that he has very much this mentality of like if there's a future of the world that I'm thinking of or that I think is better, it's like the only way it's going to happen is if I actually get my answer and try to do it, right? And so, um, I think it's generally true, right, across every industry that the most people don't think that way. Most people think like I can do whatever consulting job or you know investment banking job or whatever and not actually build anything is just going to get better. Like if everybody was doing that, we'd have a problem, right? And so, but yeah, and so, but that's the important thing to acknowledge that like, this chip innovation, it's not just going to fall. It's not just going to be there. Like somebody will create it and it's freaking hard, right? And I think there needs to be appreciation for the fact that these problems are very difficult to solve. Like with generally speaking, I think like within a lot of emerging technology right now, like which is one of the reasons that I like to invest in that space is because I think it's huge. It represents a huge paradigm shift, and this is kind of across the suite of companies that we invest in. I think they're extremely impactful, but they're also extremely difficult in many ways. And like right now, it's a lot of early pioneers, and it's fun. It's fun to back people that are actually willing to take on that kind of kind of a mission, right, to build things that are extremely impactful, but also difficult to do, or difficult to kind of will into existence, if you will. And so I think it's important. And again, that's why I like to invest in those spaces, because it's easy to invest in B2B SaaS, or not to, be Debbie Downer, right? But I think it's more impactful to just back people that are doing things that are art, right? And so, but potentially very powerful.
Yeah, yeah. It's um, like building things for the flat screen computing devices is like it's gone so uh, so much traffic there that you have to like innovate on a better button, for example, right? And,
100%.
and
I mean, that's always the argument that I actually bring to
yeah,
this, right? Is that it's really difficult to look at the consumer internet right now in its 2D modality that we're used to, and say that, like, what is the real, like, new opportunity here? Like, it's so saturated with every particular kind of service. Like, how much more canvas is there? And to me, it almost feels, if I'm looking at building a company and I'm looking at it from a 10-year time horizon, I actually think it's riskier to say we're not going to pursue, a kind of more multimodal modality, so to
it's
speak, that we're
very
computing
risky.
in, right? Like,
It's like status.
no, exactly, right. And I actually think, for me, it's like less risky to say, like, let's start building something that levers some of these new technologies, right? Which, again, going back to the point, like, why I think this is all convergent in the future. Right now there's VR, there's these AI wearables, quote unquote, these semantic differences, right? They're kind of emphasizing different new sensory inputs. But to not build on those kind of rails to some extent, I think, for me, actually feels a lot more risky than saying, let me just build some B2B SaaS tool, that computes in exactly the same way everything's been on for the last 15 years. It's extremely saturated. Um, yeah, that's at least how I feel personally, especially since it seems so unequivocal at this point that, like, we are moving on from this. I think if every innovation you think you've seen over the last 6 months that sort of made waves in Silicon Valley indicates to me that we're moving away from this sort of conventional way of computing that we have been in the last, call it 15, 20, 25 years, whatever it is. We're like, even all the AI stuff, right? Look at what even OpenAI is doing right now. Like, none of these companies, OpenAI, Google, whatever, they're stopping at these sort of LLMs, right? It's like all going multimodal, right? It's all going towards what I interpret, frankly, as being robots, right? To some extent, right? And it's actually interesting, in my opinion, the more you look at them, like, okay, well, this goes into, you know, 3D modality, because robots are also spatial technology, just from a different end of the spectrum. I call it all spatial. Because again, what is a robot really doing? You're trying to get something human-like to actually compute in its natural, in its physical
Mm.
environment. That's spatial, right? Um, you start to look at some of those companies, you actually start to realize, like, wait a minute, there's actually a VR component to this. You actually start to realize that, like, VR and AR are actually, like, and robotics to some extent are on the same spectrum, but at different ends of it, right? And so, for example, there are plenty of companies. Like, one I saw, I met with them before, but I've also seen around Twitter now the last couple of days, people talking like Carbon Origins, right? That are, for example, using VR headsets to let
Which one?
people, Carbon Origins is the name. They're a very interesting company. They're letting people basically control like remote robots, right, in a different location through inputs in a VR headset. I've spoken to companies that in varieties of ways are either working with robotics companies or building robotics companies that are using some of the, human behavioral tracking that, like, VR headsets enable, right? Like hand movements, eye tracking, these sorts of things, like the Quest Pro, Vision Pro now too, to actually use as training sets to build kind of humanoidish robotics stuff, right? These sorts of things. It's like you actually start to see that there really a lot of intersects with this. And I think when and all of that, then is kind of the glue to a lot of that is the AI stuff, right? Because, like, for example, in that case, you're using data from VR to um, to train AI models that ultimately make robotics move, right, or kind of animate robotics. Um, you start to see how that whole picture comes together, and so I'm really just convinced that everything you've seen really come big out of Silicon Valley over the last 6 months has sort of been like felt like a bit of a step, if you will, points to that direction. Um, and so for me, if I'm starting a company, I would find it incredibly risky to look at all of that and just ignore it and be like, that we're not going to acknowledge the fact that robots are coming, VR is coming, AI kind of makes all of these things tick together, etc. Right? Because AI is of course not just beneficial for the robotics, but it's also very beneficial for VR. If you look at it from the perspective of, for example, environment creation, right? If we're sort of assuming we're going to have all these 3D environments, we know how long it takes to make these things manually. If we want this to be scaled, we need, kind of AI enabled tools that help us do it quicker, right? Like, and more effectively, as one example, right? So that's just a picture that I think it very clearly has been coming together for the last 6 months. I think more people are getting it. And so I was building a company, I'd be just like, why, I think you're nuts if you're not sort of like trying to take that to account
Mm.
for what you're doing. Again, maybe obviously I'm biased because that's, what I'm kind of staking our fund on all that stuff, but I just feel like I'm also in it because it's so obvious to me. So that maybe is one thing of a founder's watch this I would take away is like, that reality is coming. How are you preparing for it?
Switching gears a little, how'd you end up at Meta? How'd you end up doing machine learning? Where are you
Yeah.
from? It's
So
like
I mean,
origin.
I always say, yeah, I always say I think I do what I do now is kind of like a culmination of effectively what I've done for, I would say, almost the last decade now. So I got into machine learning 2014, 15-ish, I would say. This was a time when it was still, you didn't have all these fancy frameworks that you have now. You didn't have all these GPUs, these like cloud
Mm,
services and stuff. Like it was very primitive back then, still compared to what it is today. And I always like to point that out because, all the kids that are starting with machine learning now don't know how good they have it in terms of like how much
mm.
power they just have.
It's like
Like
the
really,
HTML days of machine learning, huh? Like,
yeah. I mean, seriously, like I mean, I remember like I was, back then I had to train stuff on my laptop, right? So if it crashed my laptop, which of course is not that much compute, like so you have to be very creative actually. So you have
mm,
to think a lot about like feature engineering and all these sorts of things, which I basically has gone out the window now. Nobody does it anymore with deep learning and all this stuff. But I think it's still very valuable practice. But I got into it because I dropped out of college at the time. I was running a company. We started having some success with it. So I said, let me just go run it full time. And it was a streaming service, but I actually discovered machine learning because our homepage got too cluttered. And so I was like, we need to build some sort of ranking algorithm that, cleans this up a little bit. It's just better, experience. Like, ranking was a big thing at the time anyway. And so I started playing with it. And, I had this aha moment with it where I was like, what I'm doing is fairly primitive, right? It's not crazy, but like, holy crap, you can see where like this is going. Like this is really gonna you can see that the direction of this is that's going to it really change that human computer relationship to some extent because it's just going to get more powerful. So anyway, fast forward, and 2 years later, we shut the company down, effectively shut it down. We kind of sunset it. I know I decided to go back to university, but I was a computer science student at the time, and I felt that, well, I just built all this production grade software, in the real world, like, what are they going to teach me here about like normal, computer science, software engineering, whatever. I want to go on this AI stuff, this ML stuff that I was kind of thinking out when I was doing the company. And so these models are started to build, whatever. So I found an advisor there that, she was more of a PhD master's kind of advisor, but kind of agreed to let me do some of the seminars and participate in some of that research that they were doing and all of that. And that was a lot of fun. And so, her focus was more on NLP. And so I found myself doing a lot of NLP for particularly the social media domain. Um, and so that, again, I learned a lot there, really leaned into it. And so when I was graduating and I was like, crap, I need to do something now. I felt that this was at the time of the whole Russia misinfo thing at Facebook with like a fake topic. And
oh,
so I was like, oh, that seems like a really interesting application of what more or less the kind of things we were looking at in some of the what I was doing in my academia, basically. And so anyway, it ended up working out. So I ended up getting hired there, joining one of their integrity teams. And so that's how I ended up at Meta initially. But the first week in the office, this was when so I was based in Menlo Park for that. They took us to the Oculus office there, and they made us try. I think it was the
EK1?
Rift.
Oh,
I'm
Rift.
not. I don't
Okay.
remember. I think it was the Rift, but I might be wrong. This was like right when I think the Quest was just coming out, because I remember
Oh.
it just came out. It was coming out, the first one. So I think it was still the Rift. And at the time I was like very like a doubter on VR. I was like, I don't get it, right? Like, this, it seems like a toy, whatever. What's the big deal? Um, but so they made us do this demo where you have to. It basically puts you at the edge of a skyscraper. And you have to take a step forward. Was the instruction, right? So like in reality, of course, you'd fall off the building, right? But you're virtual reality. And this is like an older headset. This is not super high fidelity or anything, right? This is
Mm.
still pretty primitive for all intents and purposes to what you have today. And I was like, nobody could do it, right? There were a few people in my cohort that were doing it in front of me. I was like, I'm not, they're all freaking out. I don't get why they're freaking out. So anyway, so they were like, give me the headset, I'll do it. I'll take the step forward. And so I take it, and I'm like, I'm scared of heights also, by the way.
Oh,
And
well, so this
so
is like double.
I started freaking out in the headset. And so when I took it off, I had this like light bulb go off over my head, right? Like very similar to like that light bulb I had with AI when I started playing, or like machine learning when I started playing with it back then when I was building these ranking systems. And I was like, this is going to change stuff. It's still very early. It's still very primitive, right? But this is just like unequivocally where I think things are just going to go. Like it has to, right? It's just, there's no way you can make a computing experience that feels this real. Like this is where it has to go. And so I decided after that that was kind of like a direction that I wanted to go into, especially being at Meta. One of the considerations, just very practically, also made at the time, was I know I came here for these integrity NLP things, but realistically, this is something I could go to Google and do. I could go to Amazon and do this. Right,
Mm.
there's a ton of big tech companies do this. Meta is the only company where I can work on VR, or like generally this 3D stuff at scale. And so anyway, long story short, as soon as they let me transfer over to that side, I did, and I kind of spent the rest of my Facebook time there. Then in parallel started angel investing in these things, right? Because, I always say, like, I didn't start investing in like AI and VR and these intersections and stuff because, like, oh, I do it, so I know it, so, I should invest in it, but more like I'm doing it as a day job because I believe in it. And so subsequently, I'm also investing in it because I believe in it firsthand. So like all the decisions were kind of guided by that kind
You're
of
the
kernel of
right kind
truth
of
that
VC. Yeah. For
so
this field.
but anyway, so long story short, like that ended up spiraling because what I realized is that like the space was really small, and it still is today, particularly on the venture side. And so I built up a lot of relationships in that space over kind of my time as an angel, and also having that operational technical background, which of course gave me a little bit of gravitas in that space, amongst like the kind of the VC world and the founders and all of that. And I think at one point last year, I just reached the point where I was like, okay, I love doing this. I really believe in this. I feel like I kind of topped out at Meta as well. And I think just my impacts personally, like my own personal, I'm going to feel more gratified just going and helping companies try to catalyze companies early in the space, and really, do what I can to try to push the space forward more broadly. And so that's where I decided to move into VC and kind of do what I'm doing now.
That's awesome. I love like that you're bringing
Oh.
that kind of a perspective to this field. Like you're kind of like metaing it. Like it's necessary to push it forward with people that understand it deeply and care about it deeply. For
Yeah,
that will make other like traditional VCs come in. Right, that will open the doors
I
for
hope so.
apples
Well, because
later.
here's the thing, one of the issues that I would say I like candidly have, right, is because, like the way, founders raised from VCs have to convince VCs of things. I have to convince LPs of things, right? I'm always kind
Oh.
of, very honest with the fact that us as VCs, we're effectively middlemen between what LPs want to invest their money in and then the actual investments through the companies, right? And so there is very much this dynamic that I think is very, very difficult to, unless you're like someone that's very established and that's kind of this big established thought leader, that has a lot of gravitas to influence. It's very difficult to convince people to put money into things that they don't think about.
Hmm.
Um, and so one of the things that I'm definitely doing is that's like, for my ends, right, is a bit of a challenge that I have, right? It's like convincing high net worth individuals, family offices and stuff that, hey, this is something you should consider putting your money into, right? And so like a lot of what I kind of try to do is to of course also spread awareness about the fact that this is a really interesting opportunity. Like a lot of what we've talked about here, where it's just like it's the unequivocal future. And do you want to be part of that kind of really early shift, right? Which is both, of course, I think probably personally gratifying, but also, if done well, very lucrative for all intents because everybody wants to be early for a new big wave. Um, but that's not easy either, right? And so it's a lot of to sort of echo what you said is like many times I do feel like I'm like the first to go to really bat for this in many ways. Not entirely, but at least from someone
You are
coming from my
batting for it
position.
though. Like I haven't seen a lot of people do it. I've seen like um, Anorak Ventures do it too.
Yeah,
Uh,
there are a few. Right, right.
Boost VC, like Draper has been good. Um,
Big time. You're the
yeah,
best. If you ask me personally, like I always say that like I think Adam and Boost VC are they're generally my favorite VC. But I think they're also like the ones that um from a VC perspective are doing the most good in terms of driving this industry forward. So like I'm an enormous Boost fan. Anorak, like you said, is a great one. Um, Founders Inc. I think quietly is doing quite a bit as well to cultivate a lot of interest and builder talent in the space. So they're also ones I like a lot. VR Fund has been around for a long time. So there are a few, but again, it's like very small, right? And um, yeah, that of course, so there's a reason it's still small, right? One of the reasons is that like they're not that many kind of big allocators that are interested in these things, right? And so that is kind of a direct consequence of that. So I think all the credit, of course, for people that have been doing their part in pushing this forward. So, um,
yeah.
but yeah,
I
those are names I think.
I look at you as like a startup founder as well. Like as like it's completely like convincing the LPs, finding the right startups. You're building like a new like a place for investment for a new place of study in a sense.
No, it's true. I mean, I always say that it's like I started a startup that invests in startups, right? It's like
Yeah,
I deal with the same problems. I deal with the same problems that my portfolio companies deal with. The only real, I guess, operative differences is that like VC funds, of course, have a very set business plan. And because of that, there's certain operational things that you need to do that you might not need to do, obviously, like if you're building a VR company. But um, it's definitely a lot of the same problems, a lot of the same trials and ups and downs, trials and tribulations, and all that comes with it. It's definitely no different. But and I think what you said is very resonant because in many ways, I feel like there's a big opportunity for folks to really come in and like plant the flag as like really championing this computing future, or like as Adam Draper's referred to me before as the software side of deep tech, which I think is a very apt term for it.
what
um
does it say it again? Software side of deep tech.
Software side of deep tech. This is not my quote. This is something you can attribute to Adam, but I kind of like that framing, which is why we're like reusing it. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to really champion it from the VC side, which I think will have a lot of like cascading effect on builders, hopefully in LPs, because obviously that ends up generating a lot of returns for funds. Naturally, it's going to get more LPs interested in it, right? So there's a lot of good I think you can do from the position of being a kind of an early believer VC in these things. That everybody kind of benefits from both sides of that kind of venture ecosystem, the companies all the way up to the LPs. Um, but of course, if you're gonna be one of those early champions, right? Like it's not gonna come easy, right? Like I personally always think the deployment side of this, because I think there's just so many really interesting, great, talented builders. There's just all this opportunity. But having the means to do it, right, to do it really meaningfully, I will gravitas is of course this challenge us for to have as GPs, right? And so um but it'll pick up. I think me personally, I can say it's felt a lot easier for me to talk to this to the general public, I would say, of course, including LPs, but like really people, even in my personal circle, that are not tech people, that are not in the space at all. It's way easier to talk about what the hell I'm doing today than it was 6 months ago.
Because of Apple, yeah.
Um, because of Apple, I think a lot of people are understanding even a little bit through the it's like small pieces of stuff that I hinted at. Like Apple is one big thing. Again, I think a lot of people see this humane pin stuff, right? Again, even though a lot of people think it's stupid, but like it presents an idea that, sticks in your head some way. OpenAI and a lot of these things about like, hey, this very like human like interaction with
Hmm.
computers, right? And so where you start to see these like kernels of different things that put together this future that we talked about, um, are also kind of being brought into the mind of I think a lot of people that are just passively consuming this because it's becoming so frequent now,
Mm.
and from different ways where maybe they don't have the whole thing drawn out, but they actually begin to understand some of the like the very premise points of what you're talking about. And I think that's already a big step forward, right? And I think that's like, again, everybody will stand to gain from that. And goes to what I said before about, it's kind of the unequivocal future, how we're going to do things that, people are slowly starting to realize that in these little kernels they get here and there, right? That ultimately is going to become this cohesive picture, but um, it started. And so like, I think it's a really exciting time for that perspective. I think to be in the space in any capacity because at least I can say in my experience, it's the first time I feel like I can talk about these things and like it's not total gibberish to most people. Like maybe a lot of it is still gibberish, but not all of it, right? And so that's like, and that's I think a big step forward that again will only continue because look at really the last 6 months, right? I mean, the last 6 months is really just one tech release announcement after the other that plays into this vision of the future, right? Like very clearly plays into this vision of the future. And again, that just makes our lives easy. Like the best way to for us to be validated is to just see it, and it's happening, right? And so we're all going to be better off because of it.
Yeah, we always forget that it's like other minds out there that are just used to a lot of
Yep.
habits, like including me, including you. In like it's like this reality that we have is like a consensus reality, like coming from our senses that make our mind be a certain way, right? And it's so
Well,
we're not fighting to introduce like new technology because like, and there's a problem that it's like tough being accepted because it's so new. It's tough to be accepted because like it's just changes habits so much. So that's why it's like
yeah,
it's a anything new is always a rejection by the brain. We always forget that we're going against
100%.
brains, not against peoples. We have like this concept of human, but it's a brain,
Yep.
and it likes doing things the way it likes doing things, and it most of the time it just doesn't like doing things. Like it doesn't like to move, it doesn't like to create.
Yeah.
It spends energy. So it's like I had to come to that conclusion. It made like things so much easier to understand and like.
It's true. This is such a good insight, by the way, and I think this is actually like a very good I would say base layer to what we mentioned earlier about this dichotomy between how Apple's going to the market and like Meta's
Mhm.
going to the market with their entrance, right? Where like because what you're describing is a lot more conducive to that exact reality, right? Where it's like it doesn't really break the habits that much, right? It feels a lot more familiar to what the brain already does, so it's less likely to reject it. Whereas again, that like full immersive reality and avatars and stuff is such a shift from what the brain is used to that's just going to flat out reject it, not want it, right? So I think that's actually a really good backdrop that I think is completely true. And it's also, I think, very good like builder advice to some extent, right? In terms of like, if you're going to build something innovative for the space, or like really introduce something new, like what is a productive way to try to start and then grow the business over time, in a way that consumers will be more receptive to it. I think it's a very good point.
Then yeah, that's like um I had to do that with Knox recently, with like Varag. We've been working on it a while. Like I've built in like VR for a while, right? Like for about like 10 years in like
Stop it.
2017, like got into Techstars, built like Rodan. It was like uh, JavaScript based web VR development tool for building cross platform
Yeah,
VR applications. Um,
right.
like too early, right? Like no, I got, and I didn't have like a good like being a good like CEO. It was like my first like rodeo. So a lot of learnings there, but like product was amazing. Um, there was like good early adopters, but like it would have now would have been a good time to build it, like to get product market fit. Um, so like
Important points.
yeah, realizing like that um, where reality lies and where you lie in it and your idea of what it should be and building for
Right.
it from, as you said, like um, ground principles, first principles. Like I like the Knox started like 3 years ago to for that reason to like, hey, what's real? What's real is like in VR, there's still a sales aspect. Like I want to build a lot of cool stuff for VR, but I need money for it. Uh, and
Right. Right.
and there's like a lot of other builders like me. Like why not like try to give us that platform where we can just launch whatever we're building really quick. And but I had to shift that yet again now, like
Right.
where we realize that hey, there's like a bigger opportunity and like to uh, with uh, with TAM and like a um, investment opportunity where like this whole thing can be applied like to all emerging tech where XR is just one sector, right? Like we
Right.
built like a commerce and sales layer for VR XR first, and then extrapolate that to the whole emerging tech sector, where like if you're humane, you use Knox to launch to the right buyer base, like because people that are buying XR are the on the edge of edge, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so like giving that tool to like kind of want to be like the Salesforce and like Mailchimp of like XR, right? Like put your product here, launch it, market it, get sales. Don't worry about it. Worry about building. Like I hate that part. I hate the sales and marketing part. So like
Right.
having that dashboard and platform where it can happen. Like now, that's what I'm saying. Like I had to come to reality. Like I had to meet
Oh
reality
yeah, yeah, for sure.
where it is.
You know, it's one of the unfortunate realities that I see, and I've seen in this industry a lot as an investor. Is I can't tell you how many companies I've seen fail that I think had very good ideas, and definitely a concept that probably 10 years from today somebody would be making a lot of money with. But they started maybe doing it 2, 3 years too early, raised some money, right? Because they were too early, then they couldn't raise follow on because they couldn't meet the milestones, right? To warrant, follow on investment. And they shut down, right? In many cases. It really happens a lot. Um, and so it's I think a really, really important point that I see in being very honest with yourself as a founder about what is a realistic growth pattern, right? And of course, the important thing to realize is that you don't build Rome in a day, right? So like you don't build your end product
Mm,
in year one of it existing, right? It's like you start with something, and of course, you kind of grow it and spread it out over time. To really be like realistically, it's like what can we do and grow and get users and all of that like today. I think that's especially true also in the larger kind of venture market right now. It's like the sort of emphasis on actually getting to market and getting users and validating that as soon as possible. Um, that's like I think a really, 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 really important point. And unfortunately, one I will also say that a lot of builders that I've talked to don't want to hear.
yeah, it's hard to
A
hear,
lot
man.
of people have got
It's so hard to hear.
me. Yeah, a lot of people have gotten very angry with me in the past for basically saying that, like, listen, like, I think it's a smart idea, it's great, you're onto something, but like, beware of timing. And that if you pursue this now, perhaps you might not get the growth and the traction, whatever you need to continue to grow on the trajectory that you want to be on. There's nothing wrong with it. Again, you always bootstrap things, whatever. Maybe you're getting some money. But if we're talking in the context of venture-backed businesses, like maybe that opportunity or that install base, whatever, is not quite there yet for this. um, a lot of people don't want to hear it. And inevitably, I would say more times than not, I've seen similar outcomes where they come to their conclusion themselves in some sort of way at some point after doing it, right? But power to them for that. But it's very prevalent, and I hope it becomes less of a problem, of course, as these ecosystems do continue to get bigger, and the install base is bigger, and all of that. That you have less of these kind of too early issues, but it's definitely still going to be a thing, and it's something I try to caution everybody to think about when they're kind of thinking about the way to approach solving a problem, to do it in a way that it's realistic today, and you kind of move forward with that vision as the market develops, and not just kind of go full beans on an idea that's maybe 10 years, 10 years too early, 3 years too early, whatever.
And
Happens
you
a lot,
take your time to
unfortunately.
explain it. Like I've seen like the way you um, like explain things on Twitter. Like even I remember I messaged you once. Like you took time to like fully get into like why, and I think that's like super important. You don't just brush it off. Like you're like take it granularly, like which is really nice to see. So
I
I
try my best, right? Like I will admit that unfortunately, I try to be as constructive as I can with everybody that reaches out to me. Of course, I also have limited bandwidth, so there's some people I can't be as helpful to, I suppose. But I try my best because again, it goes to um what you said before. I mean, I think for me, anybody that's trying to put their time, which is I think the most valuable resource, of course, for humans is time, right? Time and effort into building this industry. I think it's a good thing, right? It's something that I commend because it's not an easy thing to do right now. It's maybe not a fashionable thing to do right now. So if there's somebody that looks at this industry and says, "Hey, this is something I want to actually contribute to and push forward in some way by building a company," I really commend that. And so for me, it's something where I'm also like, hey, if I can, from my vantage point, provide something valuable, even if I'm not investing in them, but even if it's just some like very lightweight feedback from, again, my vantage point as a VC, I guess, that sees a lot of what goes on in the space and the realities of it and all of that. I try to do it as much as I can. Again, I can't always do it with everybody, and but I try to do it as much as I can, and particularly with people where I feel like there's a lot of genuine effort here. And so I think it's important, right? I think it helps everybody. Like everybody wins with that, right? Because like even us as VCs, like we win if there are more people building
Mhm.
great companies.
Building, yeah.
So for me, it makes a lot of sense to like, hey, there's a talented early kind of outside the box thinker. Maybe they just need a little push in the right direction. They really land on something that little stick, right? Um,
What are
so
some
even just looking at it, oh, it's a win for me.
what are some of your latest investments?
Well, the last one we closed was Throwback Studios, which they made a game called Derby, which
Oh,
Jordan, yeah, Jordan is he's like I think he's a guy I would totally bring if I was doing a podcast. He's probably what I'd love to do is I've sent this to Jordan before for sure. Is I would love to put Jordan and Six on a podcast together.
Six sounds so
I like
cool. Like that guy is like really good.
I love it. Like what I love about both of them is they're like for me the two like two of the really some of the great thinkers in VR. Like anytime I talk to Six also, I'm like I learned something. Anytime I talk to Jordan and I talk to Jordan a lot, like we kind of really have like serious conversation. I mean, I learned something about, but from very, very different angles and different really ways of looking at it. And so they're both really interesting, opinionated people, but kind of coming from different viewpoints. And I think it'd be really fascinating to just have them kind of like moderate them and just say, like, go talk about this. And I think it'd be really, really interesting for anybody building the VR space. Um, but kind of like back to the question. So yeah, Jordan, I think is just a really great innovator on how VR I don't know if you want to call it creator economy, but basically how people are using, I would say, VR to benefit for themselves monetarily, um, and social media are kind of all tied together. And I think he's a really great innovator there in the sense that I feel for the last few months or better part of last year, at least up to now, he's rewriting a lot of the rules on how to build VR companies. On a really
Mm. Wow.
strict budget and all of that, and and really bringing some valuable insights that I think are being accepted. And the growth in Derby really shows that that he really knows what he's talking about and he's really onto something. And so he's what I'm really excited about, to just kind of get behind him and Cody and what they're doing. I think is really exciting. Um, yeah, so that was the last one that we did. So like a lot of our early investments actually been in studios and all of that, because I think just we're still at a stage with a lot of these technologies, and like I think this is generally true for um all of these emerging technologies, not just VR. This is also true for a lot of AI. Is definitely true for robotics. But I think we're still kind of in the content, like consumer product era of these things, because they're very new. And so it's still a lot of proof of concepts, basically, about like these
Mm.
are valuable experiences that you get from these new mediums. This is a product, right? You can make money with it. I mean, even like I always have point to ChatGPT as an example for that, right? Where ChatGPT, of course, really captured that like zeitgeist of this AI wave and the, really that future. Um, I'm not sure if that would have happened if they would have treated and walled in ChatGPT the way they did GPT-3, which came out 3 years before. I think even 3.5. It came out like summer 2020, 2020, I think. Um, that was, GPT-3. I remember reading about it when it came out. At the time, very impressive technology. I think really put the writing on the wall over a lot of this LLM stuff is going. Not as good as as ChatGPT, of course, but still like fairly impressive. But the only way they made it available was basically through API, right? So you had to write some Python script to
Wow.
call it, right? So how many people are actually going to use that, right? Like the average consumer is not going to write a Python script to use GPT-3 to do anything, right? Um, Whereas ChatGPT, they basically built this consumer product. I mean, they've made a lot of money off that consumer product. First of all, well, that's really the thing that really exploded the value of ChatGPT, at least in public opinion. And so I think that's just like a data point of like, hey, that was a consumer product that made this so successful, even probably for its enterprise usage. And so we're still, I think, at that stage of a lot of these technologies. And so for us, a lot of the focus is frankly product and content, consumer, these sorts of things, because those I think are the first companies that are really going to put a dent into really helping these companies, helping these technologies really like integrate themselves into our computing norm. So that's kind of where we are right now. So that's why I've kind of biased towards VR content, VR studios, those sorts of things right now. So a lot of our like a few of our investments have been in that state, in that all are.
You said something interesting on your Substack, like AI software is now a consensus bet and a better investment for
Yeah,
large funds.
yeah.
Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, this is going into like maybe just like the very like kind of fundamental venture, right? Like what makes sense. And so the premise, of course, is that the best venture investments, so subsequently, of course, the deals that generate the largest returns, are typically deals where you bet in something non-consensus that ends up being right.
Okay, so
Right
unicorn.
is usually where you have the most asymmetry in venture. That also just gets sheerly numeric, right? Like just putting that numerically together. If I invest in a company at a 5 million post, let's just say across all these scenarios, you have the same level of dilution for the sake of argument. And that company sells for $1 billion versus I invest in a company at $25 million post and then the company sells for $1 billion. You can see how much more numerically calculate that like my return is going to be way higher the first scenario than the second, like magnitudes higher. And so that's like the very premise of like, okay, these are where the big returns are going to come from. Now, the problem with AI software is I think it's no longer non-consensus, right? I think everybody in the market, almost, I would argue, in the developed world, understands that this technology is a very big shift in how we do a lot of things. And there are probably going to be a lot of valuable companies that are being created off the back of these AI rails.
Hmm.
And so it makes sense to put money into it. And so what you really ended up seeing in the market, for me, at least from my vantage point, is that it's going to be really difficult to make that kind of big outlier return, because the actual good deals, right, the deals that you really want to be part of, where there's a lot of conviction that this will do quite well, have a lot of the money, a lot of venture money coalescing around it. And so subsequently that pushes up the round sizes and subsequently the valuations and the entry prices that you're going to be getting to those companies. And so, for a fund, let's say of our size, or a small pre-seed fund, that is going to have returns driven by, a real extreme outlier at some point. You're not going to get it from those kinds of deals at all, like and they're probably going to raise a lot of money and you're going to take a lot of dilution. And so if you're putting a small check in as an early investor, like, what are you really going to pull out of it at the end? Whereas that model makes sense for huge funds with bigger AUMs that, really do more money on money investing than they do, kind of asymmetry investing, if you will, right? Where they can invest a lot of money over multiple stages to have big ownership of that company, especially when it has a liquidity event at some point, which is a very different game to what, like, early pre-seed funds play it. You look at that reality and it just really stops to make a lot of sense to let's put it this way, very actively pursue a lot of AI software deals. Not to say that we wouldn't do any, because I think there's certain verticals that, like, we are still extremely competitive in and can probably have a very good entry for us. But generally speaking, it's gotten a lot more competitive in consensus. And so, it just changed the dynamic of what those investments look like and for whom it makes sense. So that's just really the also just our fun background on that point.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. I think, yeah, that helped me understand it too. It's like a very heavy VC play philosophy,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
much different than what we had before, where it's like, as you said, like asymmetry, unicorn. This is more like creating the whole pie for everyone and then like taking pieces from here and
Yeah,
there.
it's
Yeah.
different, right? Like, and so I think, like, and I always say there's a difference between when a certain kind of industry or company is consensus versus non-consensus, right? When it's consensus, it makes sense for a certain type of investor with a certain type of strategy. Um, when it's non-consensus, it makes sense for a different kind of investor with a different kind of strategy. And so, I think it's just kind of it's just worth acknowledging, for example, that AI is obviously has sort of come from something very quickly that was emergent, um, and perhaps to something people were trying to figure out, to something that everybody, their grandmother is investing in and everybody wants to be part of. And so subsequently there's a lot of money and a lot of noise in that industry, and that just at some point it makes sense
Hmm.
to say, depending on what the strategy is, to say maybe right now for us this is not where we're at our most competitive, and focus on things where there is basically, the way I always surmise it is, AI right now is high impact over invested, but where can we play that's high impact under invested? So for us, what I feel right now is the high impact underinvested, going at least in 24 foreseeably, is going to be VR, and it's going to be probably consumer robotics. And so that's probably going to spend more time than. Oh, by the way, all these businesses have AI components to them, right? So it's not like clearly delineated, but things that I'll call kind of being AI first software, kind of like layer one AI sort of things, is pretty saturated. So over invested, which just doesn't make sense for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're looking now for that was my next question for VR robotics, like layer two AI companies. Yeah, like
Yeah, basically, yeah. I mean, like, yeah. I more put under like VR robotics, and it's like kind of baked in that probably a lot of these businesses will have AI components to them, right? So it's not like if it has AI, I don't want to touch it, right? That's not really the point. It's more like where the end means and or the end markets, and that's more on the VR robotics side where I'm putting a lot of my focus. And I think I just personally find it like that's where you're going to start actually seeing a lot of the fruits of what's happened in AI over the last year. And I think you're starting to see the signs of that with these like multimodal models and even LLMs in themselves, are just really going to enable a lot of really cool things, or have been enabling really cool things in these spaces. And so that kind of downstream impact of AI is something that I find actually very exciting, and where my own personal curiosity is kind of more just located right now. Um, so again, all this stuff is connected, like I mentioned before. I think it's going to be more and more difficult to delineate between like what is a VR company, an AI company, a
uh,
robotics company. We have a lot of companies doing kind of all of it, or at least two of them, right, that are intersecting. So it's going to get more difficult, but more, there's a difference between, hey, we're a company that's building like a humanoid robot that cleans your dishes, which of course has a very heavy AI dependency. Versus like, we're doing some like AI prediction software that runs your web browser, right? Like there's obviously a difference. And so like the former, is something that's really interesting. The latter is something that, like I said before, is saturated. It's kind of what you're not going to be spending time on.
What kind of companies are you looking like stage wise, like very early, pre-idea,
Pre-seed.
pre-seed?
Pre-seed, I never say there's too early per se, right? There are a lot of things that I think determine for me whether a founder or team is ripe for investment. But like fundamentally, like we invest in like first institutional rounds or before, like so that anywhere there's fair game. But like we don't do full seed rounds, right? If you've already raised like 1.5 million a year prior, you're raising again. Too late for us. We like to come in really early. So yeah, we're kind of like first check-ish kind of first round investors for sure.
What does um, like a good day in Arian's life look like? Like, what's your perfect day?
Oof, that's a good question. I definitely think the days that for me feel the most gratifying, at least in from a VC perspective, is some like demonstrative founder success. Like, we invested in a founder and they got a term sheet for their next round from some VC, or they released a product feature and it absolutely blew it out the water on traction. And you're really celebrating kind of that they've made this huge step forward on the business side, things like that. Because I think part of the reasons why I like this line of work is I really like working with founders and watching them sort of like things that we believe in succeed and all of
Mhm.
that. And so just watching out, I think for me, um is definitely the most fun thing. So I think just in an operative sense also, like I think my favorite days on the job are just ones where I'm talking to founders all day. Like those are like my favorite. And so I always say that like my order of sequence of things I love to do as a VC is, you know, portfolio support is my favorite thing to do actually. Talking to new founders is definitely the most like intellectually interesting thing.
Mhm.
Um, and then like the other thing is like talking to LPs, which to be honest I actually like doing, but maybe not as much as I like talking to founders, right? Um, So yeah, I mean, that's kind of you really if I'm doing kind of a lot of those things. It's always kind of fun for me. So um, yeah, it's a people business, right? I always say like VC is a very very people business, and so I think a day where you just really talk to a lot of interesting people, which I think is the coolest thing about this job, because I always kind of joke that I either talk to people that are more interesting than me, which is like founders, or I talk to people that are definitely richer and often more interesting than me, which is the LPs. Um, so like if I just have my day loaded talking to those people, it's like a good day because I think I pull a lot out of it. Um, so for me, that's usually like I sign off the day. If I had a day like that, it's usually it was a pretty fun day for me.
That's awesome. One like very good tangent is this has been I've been meaning to ask you your photo.
Yeah,
I love it. It's
yeah.
so weird. Like, what is it? Like, where did it come from? Is it
It's a,
Metallica?
it's a total joke.
Okay,
So this I bought. So go on actually because you're sharing the screen. I don't know if this is gonna come up on the podcast, but this is a good way to do it. So go on to
it
put in
is.
Nikita beer bar.
Oh, I've
So
seen
if you
that
go
guy.
start,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So look at his and then look at mine, and so it'll start to make sense. So you can see it's like variation of the same profile picture. So the background to this is he as a joke because he's basically like one of the most legendary shit posters in on Twitter. He at the height of this NFT bubble made this joke NFT collector OpenSea called Nikita Shit Posting Club.
yeah. These are
That's
this podcast is actually made by and made in Armenia. Um,
okay.
yeah,
Very cool.
they just
Yeah.
raised like 13 million round, and their CTO was my co-founder for Rodan before. So
Oh, nice. Okay. Very
really
cool.
cool
Yeah.
company. Really like doing a
Yeah.
making a product that's like super cool. Okay, back to, hold on, Nikita.
Yeah, so I don't know where you got cut off. I can like happy just take it off the top there.
Yeah, hold on. Whoops. Okay, from here. So,
Yeah, so if you go to Nikita's profile, Nikita Beer, you'll see that profile picture. And so it's of course, you'll see that my picture and his picture are approximates. And so he had always had this, but I guess during the NFT bubble in 21, I guess, he as a joke made this OpenSea NFT collection called Nikita's Shit Posting Club. So my profile pictures, I bought one of them actually, is one of
oh,
those Nikita. And so I put it as a joke at the time too, right? Because it's like, it just fit. It was just the zeitgeist of the time, right? Shit posting, NFTs, whatever. I thought the whole thing was funny. I was entertained by it. So it's the only NFT I ever bought. Was this thing because it was a joke.
goodbye.
And so I put it on. I think I had like, I don't know, 100 followers or something at the time, right? So everything I did on Twitter was a total joke, and I just never changed it. And so I've thought about changing it, but because I feel like at this point I've gotten somewhat associated with this thing because a lot of people ask me about it, I'm like, I don't feel so urge to get rid of it. I probably will at some point, but right now it's doing the job for me. So kind of just happy to have it there, continue to have that joke live on.
That's
So
awesome.
uh, it's kind of the background. So you got to put Nikita Beer as again like brilliant shit poster, kind of uh, legend, really
Yeah, his posts are funny. I follow him. It's
hilarious,
really really good. What? Uh,
absolutely hilarious.
I have like two more questions for you.
Yep.
What what's progress for you, or what's the purpose of progress for you and for
It's a
like
good question.
humanity? Like, why are we building all these things?
I mean, I think this is a very philosophical question, and so one thing that I always say is that and I've said this for years actually, and to be honest, I feel a bit vindicated because I think it's just getting more obvious. Is at some point technical progress is not going to be a question of like technical limitation or ability anymore, right? Because I think for a long time over a lot of things of like, can we build something, and that really is the hurdle to everything. Um, I think that's going to diminish over time, and everything's going to start becoming more and more of a philosophical question about what are the ends of all of this that we're actually trying to achieve,
Mhm.
right? And like, are we ever reaching a point where there's too much technology for all intents and purposes to the extent that it actually diminishes our human experience, right? And so like one of the real philosophies like we have with our fund is enriching the human experience, augmenting the human experience, right? It's like really the ends of what we're trying to do, right? So technology is great as long as its end goal is to make our lives better as humans, right? Where we can like live more fulfilled lives, because I think ultimately as spiritual beings or whatever you want to call them, beings, souls, right? Like I think when we all die one day, and I can't say this of course before I've died, so I can't tell you, but my guess is, most people are looking at, reflecting on how they lived life, right, as really like the thing that defines success for them when they're laying on their deathbed, right? That often is defined by like family goals or like things that they achieve kind of at a familiar level or experiences that they made. It's not often about the hours they spend in the office and all these sorts of things, right? And so if we're using technology to make our lives more fulfilled, I think that's a good thing, right? And I think that's what we should be doing. The question is though, like, is everything that we're doing really contributing to that, or actually going to work against that? And so I will say, and there are certainly people that are going to watch and be like, oh, he's a D-cell, all these sorts of these insults they throw at you on Twitter now if you question
Yeah,
anything
yeah.
other than just like forward of technological progress.
I've been thinking of
Um,
forking it actually. the,
I mean, it's like I just think it's funny, right? To some extent, that it's like again, we have to like we don't have religion anymore for all intents and purposes in the West, but like let's just replace religion with institutionalized philosophy on how to build technology. basically religion. So that's like a totally different conversation. Um, but I think that's like the thing that I'm particularly nervous about. I think to some extent also why I feel somewhat of a missionary aspect to what we're doing as pre-seed investors in these very frontier spaces, because we're in many ways like partially gatekeepers to some ideas that may succeed or not, right?
Yeah.
And so there's, I think, a bit of a missionary aspect to that for me, where we can kind of do our part in trying to prevent ideas that are potentially disruptive and really will like destroy the fiber of society, which is what I'm concerned about. Because frankly, like I think things like VR and AI and a lot of these things can be very conducive to actually net negative effects on society if misused. And the problem that I'm also very kind of weary of is these net negative effects can often be things that are actually quite lucrative.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a lot of people that like incentivize to build these things. Like one example that I always sort of give are these ideas of like AI girlfriends and companions and all of that. Which, like the AI girlfriends one is the like one that I'm extremely critical of and cynical of, because the way this often gets justified, even if people want to put it in a positive lens and not just say it's an easy money grab, is, well, we have a loneliness epidemic, right? Everybody knows that is an actual problem, right? It is something that I think is it's technology can't be used to fix. But the premise is we have a loneliness epidemic, so the solution is to make people feel less lonely, is to give them like AI companions and stuff that effectively stimulate their feelings, right? So I always say it's technical sedation, actually, right? Because you're kind of actually trying to remove the very core human needs emotional needs that people, non-economic needs that humans have, and sedate it with technology, which is actually artificial. And so I personally consider that somewhat immoral. But some people use that as a justification that actually they're doing a just thing because they're helping people solve this problem. My counter argument would be that it actually exacerbates it, and it's like a band-aid solution, right? It's like kind of like putting people on drugs to some extent, and saying you're solving the problem. Whereas, you could go kind of deeper and say, well, how do we, like, for example, leverage VR or AR, these things to actually bring people more, like, to encourage actual people to get to communicate with each other, right? In some sort of way, like actually having another true human on the other side of the interaction. And those are the questions, kind of products that we should be building and encouraging, rather things that try to abstract actual human interaction away from us, right? And so, another one that I was always critical of was, I think they pivoted now. It was like, Circle Labs, what they did for these kind of like AI best friends or whatever for kids. Because I'm like, I think it's very dangerous or to give kids that, where they're going through kind of their early socialization path, when they're first starting to deal with other kids outside of their house that maybe they don't like or they don't get along with, which are kind of like very core competencies to be like a functioning member and contributing member of society at some point in the future. To just say, well, I don't like this kid in kindergarten or in first grade, so screw it. I'm going to go talk to my AI best friend that just reinforces all of my, character traits and not actually deal with this. Like, do you think that that is a kid that is ultimately being set up to be like a real contributor to society, where we know that like anybody that ever builds anything has to deal with a lot of adversity, particularly other people? Um, you
Oh
know,
my God.
that to me is like a very scary reality that we need to kind of be very cautious about. Um, and so like, that's, kind of to answer your question about progress, it starts there and extrapolates out, right? That, I don't think we should be encouraging technological growth that really abstracts us away from very core human behavior. Instead, we should be using it to actually let us do those things better or to do more of it. And so for me, progress would mean we are continuously building systems that let basically enrich our human experience, right? Or really like kind of let us engage with more real people, build more meaningful relationships with different kinds of people, which I think is very much they're able to do. Those rails are definitely there. You just have to use it that way. And again, the flip side is it's extremely easy to probably make a lot of money off exploiting people, like, because I think it's exploitive, in an exploitive manner, technically sedating, for example, these like lonely single men with AI girlfriends. Um, it's a lot easier to do, but I don't think it's the right thing. I think it really takes us down the wrong direction. And so those are like, that's just an example, but like things I'm always constantly thinking about with like, where are we going with all of this?
Yeah, I love it. It's you're for it for bettering the spirit,
Like
bettering.
that's what it's all about, right? Like seriously, like I think all of us, if we think about like the best moments in our lives or whatever, right? They're all very experiential,
Mhm.
right? They're usually involved with people, right? Like, you know, it's a very like we as humans are frankly like we're not robots. Like we're like wired as in a very particular way. And like ultimately, like maybe it sounds very spiritual or whatever or
Good.
metaphysical, I don't know. But like in the end of the day, like what's the point of all of us being here, right? And that's like what's the point of our existence at the end of the day, right? Like, and how does technology play a role into that? Which is always why I say, like, I think the more and deeper we get into technology, I think the more people are going to do much like people did during the Enlightenment. You know, really kind of like concern themselves with this question of the purpose of their own existence, right? Which I think is I mean, in some ways, I think we were a bit nihilistic at this point as a society, right? Or it's like everything, or like, or maybe not a nihilistic, or perhaps utilitarian. Like, I think Silicon Valley definitely has a very utilitarian view of the self and the human existence, which I think is actually very unfortunate. But you know, I think there are going to be people that ask that question more and more, right? You know, and I think ultimately the consensus on that philosophy is what is going to drive certain technical directions for others at some point. I just hope this the reckoning doesn't come too late, right? But um, I think ultimately that's just going to have to drive technological progress and not actually like the what we can do within the
Yeah.
bounds of the limitations that we have, how we rank them, but more like how do we think about our own existence as humans coexisting with this kind of technology, like what it means and what the purpose is.
More. I'm in that boat too. Like I got into VR because it was by accident, like, and then it was cool. But like throughout it, I realized that, man, like we can really build a medium that enables us to share that like inner sun, right? Like all of us, like all of us are beautiful. That we have a lot of beauty to share, and like the only like one of the main reasons is like limit of like the symbol rate is too slow, right? Like with letters and like video medium or not. That's why, like as you said, experience is king.
Yeah.
And being.
I'm giving like an example where I think like VR is like a really meaningful medium for human, like establishing like previously impossible human connection. And again, these concepts are still primitive. I do want to point that out, but just like you could conceptually see where this is going, and that this is like I think a positive thing, right? Take something like online dating. Um, you know, whether we like it or not, of course, online dating has become a very normative thing. Like most couples are now meeting through dating apps in the US, at least, right? Take whatever view of that you want, but that's kind of empirically the reality now. What's also empirically reality is that it seems to be very Pareto distributed in terms of, you know, the top 10% of physically attractive people, either gender, are the ones that get most of the matches, etc. So it works well for physically attractive people. Doesn't work particularly well, let's say, for people that aren't considered that physically attractive by, you know, the general public, let's say, or at least people on these apps. Um, and of course, you're geographically bound still, right? Because it's just connecting you to people in your locale. So, you know, there's all these kind of these geographic limitations on it and so forth. So anyway, it's like it's the way things work. There's certain things that are good about it, certain things are bad about it. Something you can do with VR. It's like I angel invested in one of these companies years ago now, I think a couple of years ago. There's like a company I'd never met, right? Where their whole concept is, you know, you're kind of meeting people on this VR dating app based on, you know, more like personality based profiles, which works for like 80% of people, for whom swiping doesn't. But also you can meet them anywhere, right? So you can, for example, go on like a walkabout mini golf date
Mm,
in VR, and I know these people, right? Like basically go on a date, quote unquote, with somebody where I actually kind of feel co-located with a sense of presence, or with somebody that's sitting on the other side of the world. Now, again, you can lever criticism of that as well, but I would say like this is actually a really nice counterbalance of bringing people together in a way that wasn't previously possible. And you know, again, it might not be for everybody the same way like the current online dating paradigm is not for everybody, but it'll work for some. It'll be very good for some, and that's I think a very good thing that VR is bringing forward. Again, I think as a concept, it's still very early. and kind of like very primitive in its technical development, right? In terms of how well this actually works and how good it feels. But, you can see where that starts to go. And because again, the crucial thing is you're talking to an actual other real person on the other side
Hmm.
of that interaction. Like you're using the kind of the VR means to be in the same room. And like you could see at some point, like, when you have like codec avatars and stuff that are kind of proliferate, like to say 10 years in the future, like, that can be like a really kind of like powerful experience for many people. And I think that's a good thing. Like, again, I'm not saying it's free of criticism. But it's a very interesting, I think, generally speaking, net positive development for a lot of people. Those are things that just are uniquely possible because of VR. These sorts of things in terms of bringing people together, right? And like that's just one example, but you can kind of extrapolate that concept out to many other things. Um, like those are good uses, in my opinion.
And to your point, like it's kind of become like technology has become like a religion in a sense. Um,
It
but
has.
but like I was talking about this with my girlfriend yesterday, Maria, about like how uh, like if you take a system, right? Like if when you take it as like a separate entity living in the now as you are, or like a state,
Yep.
right? Like say like Russia or something like it's constantly in the now as you are, and it's being fed with thousands of minds, fed, so it's grows into something immense. And like when like let's
Yeah.
say a leader comes and like plugs themselves in, it's not the same Russia as it was 100 years ago. It's a bigger, better, it's a more powerful system, or any system. So they're just living in the now like this. And we take that and apply it to us, like technology and our psyche. Like
Yeah.
we equate technological development to development, and we compare it to the past, but there's no past. And like our psyche development has not like caught up to that. There's like a big um
Yeah.
delta, and we
Yeah. Yeah.
mistakenly
Exactly.
equate them as like development, but it's not. Like it's
No,
there's like and like one question there, like is progress, like is it a um, species specific interface concept, um, or or
it's it's a good question. Because kind of going off the answer to kind of I gave you previously about, well, a lot of this comes down to human experience and does it really
mm,
make it better for us, right? Do we live more fulfilled lives sort of because of some of the technological progress we've brought on? And honestly, to this day, the future, you have to say that's been true, right? I think it's hard to argue that as a whole, the technological progress that we've kind of been on, really since the Enlightenment, actually all through human history, hasn't made life better for us. But the question, of course, is there a point where you reach the summit and starts actually doing the opposite, causing the opposite effect? Um, you take a step even further back from that and look at it in a very Darwinistic way and say, well, the point of the species is really just to procreate, right? That's really like the end all be all to everything, is like procreation, like just ensuring the existence of posterity. Um, if that's the case, um, and we look at it from that lens, like, are we actually doing ourselves favors right now? Because like a lot of the trends, for example, would suggest that modern society, of course, is not as interested in procreation. Like look at Japan,
mm,
which is usually, you know, I would say maybe a decade or two ahead of the rest of the world. Birth rates are down. It's like the population is actually decreasing in Japan. And because, it's like you could look like year over year, like, I think the graph that I saw, I think it was in 5-year intervals. The percentage of both men and women that are basically saying they're not interested in serious romantic relationships or, um, having children or whatever is like increasing, right? And that reflects itself in the fact that the Japanese population is declining. And they have probably a basket of a lot of the things that we're experimenting with now as well, because if they've had this idea of AI girlfriend, not in the same rendition, but the sheer concept of like a digital companion for much longer than we have now in the West. And nobody really knows what has caused this, at least from what I've tried to research. There's no definitive conclusion about like this is the cause of that population decline, or like there's the decrease in birth rates and all of that. But we have ideas of a basket of factors, and so we have a lot of those similar sorts of aspects. Like
Yeah.
some of them maybe people don't hear, but like like the digital companionship is one element. Another thing they brought, for example, is like gender equality, right? That like it's not the paradigm anymore that women stay at home and they need the husband to go work, and there's sort of that relationship. But now women work, they make the same kind of money or whatever. That they're just less interested in having a partner because of that, because they have the same freedoms and liberties. Again, maybe some people don't like that, or it's not PC, but that's something that's been referenced. So again, I'm just kind of repeating what some of the reports said that I've read. And so we have that same basket of factors in the West now for all kinds of purposes, particularly as we introduce that we introduce these technologies now, like AI and all these sorts of things, AI companions, girlfriends, whatever, friends. So is that not going to start having the same effect on us? Because I think it'd be strange to think that we're just going to fundamentally react at a human level different than the Japanese have to whatever their extenuating factors are, right? And so where you're maybe getting to a point in terms, to use the term progress, we've maybe empirically, from in a Darwinistic sense, reached a point that we're actually going to start decreasing the world population naturally, right? Like there's not some sort of like crazy event that wipes out the population, but actually like we are making lifestyle decisions because of the progress that we've brought on and the effect that that's had on the individual, that we're actually not interested anymore in the very core Darwinistic purpose of our existence, which is to kind of ensure posterity. To me, would be the other way of looking at it, saying that maybe we've already kind of past that point of
Collapse wave.
Peak ideal level of technological progress. Because again, from a species perspective, from a natural selection, all that sorts of stuff, like it's actually, less people are procreated is bad, right? Because it's going to lead effectively over long term to extinction to some extent, right? So again, looking at it very Darwinistically. So from that point, you could say, well, that maybe the animals are actually better off than us right now, right? Because many animals perhaps don't have this problem necessarily. Maybe they're not top of the food chain, but they're not really not procreating because of weird extenuating circumstances that they brought on as a species, right? So that's just another viewpoint to it, and kind of I think touches on your question in terms of as kind of specific to a species. But for me, that's going to be a very interesting trend to watch in the West over the next decade or two. Is do across the collective West, is there a decline, or this quote unquote collective West, right? But are there indications that we're following the same pattern that Japan has been following for the last, I think, 15, 20 years or so, if I'm not mistaken? That to me is going to be interesting, because if the answer is yes, it would mean that as a species we're actually starting to, maybe our definition of progress in many parts of society is wrong. Let's put it that way.
There's a it's good. Funny you mentioned Japan. Like I've been thinking about it too, and like taking Japan as an example. Like I would read like headlines, population is going down in Japan and stuff, and then as a human, I'm thinking, okay, so what's so bad about that? Like we have like right, like this as using your term, the collective West has this idea of like capitalism is like things need to grow. If it's not growing, it's dying.
Right.
And then I can take and apply that on an evolutionary perspective too. Like if an organism is not growing, it's like in stasis, it's dying. Again, I don't know if that's my species specific interface, like giving it subjectivity. Um,
Right, right,
um, but that growth mentality um, might be bad. Like
right.
again, like it's these and like, and that might be, this might be a result of that, as you were saying. And I think the answer is that like I started analyzing it on me, like why don't I want to have a lot of kids and why am I not having a lot of kids now is, man, this extreme growth with capitalism, money, everything is, there's so much stress added to me. We're like, yeah, I'm living a
Yeah,
better life
yeah.
than my ancestors were,
Uh,
but to procreate in this system is so hard. It's like taking my mind to like a it needs to be stress free, and I'm not never stress free. So it's,
I,
I think that the answer might lie there, why we're seeing it in Japan, and what Japan is like the most extreme of that, and we are going to, I think, see it here too.
yeah, I agree. I agree. I think you're completely right, and I think that's definitely one of those like kind of basket of factors that I mentioned, right? I think is exactly what you said. That like, in very practical terms, at least in the U.S., right, having a kid is like an extraordinary financial commitment,
Mm,
right? Like in many ways, and like it's a big economic cost that a lot of people, frankly, just can't afford, right? And so that's like a very true thing as well. I think definitely one of the contributing factors to it. Which I actually I like your rendition of it. That like, hey, there's some sort of like, this is a consequence of this like extreme constant growth mentality, right? That in certain parts of the world, of course, it doesn't exist, right? But I think that's a very fair analysis. The other side, I think what you said about, well, is this population going down actually always necessarily have to be a bad thing? I think the other side of the argument that you could take is like, let's just kind of do it in a very reductionist way, where we say, okay, well, who are the people in society that are going to be less likely to procreate? Let's say it's the ones that have the AI digital girlfriends, right? That subsequently have their emotional needs stimulated away, sedated away. They don't need to go out and find like a true companion for all intents and purposes. If we assume that then also that those are has a very large overlap with the group of people that are not considered, let's call it, top decile of attractiveness. And attractiveness is also, of course, very often tied to like evolutionary benefit, right? It's kind
mhm.
of primal instinct, right? That really the only people that are actually going to be continuing to procreate are the ones that are the most, actually the most evolute, like really true survival of the fittest, almost like an induced survival of the fittest experiment. Where the most evolutionary fit, quote unquote, humans are the only ones that actually procreate. You know, does it actually lead to like perhaps the human race gets smaller, but also more advanced?
More equal.
This Yeah, basically, like, let's say like the humans of the future, right, are all, the extent of the average like global height. I forgot what the average like height across the world for men is, but I think it's like 5'8" or 5'9" or so. Let's just say, let's just say instead of the average height for men, kind of the global population being 5'8", the humans in 100 years, the average height of men is 6 feet tall, for example, right? Like they're just like bigger, right, more physically kind of apt beings. Maybe they're higher IQ, right? These sorts of things on average. Um, could that be a potential consequence? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, I don't know, right? But like, those are kind of other ways, I guess, you could try to spin it, perhaps. Um, so in any case, I think like the way I would summarize it is like I just have like theories on what could potentially happen. I don't have a particular conviction one way or the other what's going to happen, other than, you know, is the trajectory for us really going to be that different in Japan, and like based on what's right? Like, why would we be so sure that's going to be different? Um, but it's going to be a very interesting social experiment that I think we're definitely going to start to see play out in our lifetime in some way, right? In many ways, not just like with procreation, but also with economies. And, are we ever actually going to reach a point where um, there are just people in the society that no longer need to have a job, right? And like there's just no place for them in the actual functioning economy. And does that transition look, and how does that look? Does that ever actually happen? Because there's some people that philosophize it will, there's some people think it won't. We don't know. I guess we'll find out, right? So there's just all these sorts of different, and then, of course, that would also have factors of procreation, of course, right, et cetera, et cetera, right? And like all these sorts of, I think, interesting social experiments that we're bringing on with this like extreme technological progress. Um, where I think it'll be interesting to like revisit this in 20 years and see what the hell happened. It's like where are we today based on where are we in 2044
Yeah.
basically with these things. Let's see.
To like, I heard like Elon say like many times, like, like we're the light of consciousness, and like it's our job to spread it. But we often, like to your point, we're equating that to technology and like growth of technology, growth of capitalism. And I think what I'm learning from this conversation with you now is that they're completely different things. Like
I
it's
so
yeah, and like being able to um, identify that chasm and not merge it together um, is going to be really important. There's this Professor Donald Hoffman. I've been like studying his work recently. Like and I got that like species specific interface concept from him. Um, is like it's going at to the point where like there's more of a reality like around us that our species specific interface does not allow us to see. So
oh I agree with that for sure.
yeah, and
Yeah,
like
that's
Gary
definitely
Nolan
true.
from Stanford, like he's pushing for that too as well. And like maybe we're not the apex species, right? Maybe there's like a reality around us that we just can't see. Like Hoffman's saying, like um, fitness drives truth to extinction, like 100% of the time. So you're never seeing objective reality. What we look at as like a tree is not. We agree on it because we have the same makeup. We have the same type of brain.
Yep,
Um,
true.
so and like taking that like with your the point with like the Darwinian evolution of it, like but there's a way like to nicely like break that too, is like, hey, maybe that is itself a species specific perspective of a theory that has a larger um, idea that's just being like translated into evolution in our species specific interface. um,
Yep.
to
True.
that,
Sorry.
I'll send the like a book link to it. It's super
Yeah, it's
good.
really interesting. I'd like to read that
I
actually.
think,
It sounds very fast. Yeah.
and to that point, like, so what's consciousness for you? My last question.
Oh my God, these are like really, really interesting questions. What is consciousness? It's interesting because of course this was I think this has always been a bit of a debate, but I think it was particularly pervasive in the AI space, or at least on AI Twitter, I should say. Um, I want to say maybe 2 years ago or so. Maybe I'm pushing it back a little bit further than it was, but um, and so there are all these. I think that the problem with all this stuff, the question basically was, oh, is AI conscious? Right?
Mhm.
Is there an AI consciousness with these things? And I'm just like, I don't know because it seems everybody has a different rendition to your point of what the hell consciousness means. If there's no really like actually like accepted, like sure you can describe it, but like is it a way like can you describe it in a reproducible manner that everybody can establish the same baseline of understanding of what it is, right? Like um we don't know, right? And so I think the question becomes relevant at some point where we do actually build like a humanoid robot that at least on the surface is able to effectively in all sorts of different modalities and engagements and stuff provide human like um reactions to things. And maybe before that, perhaps something that could be like animal like, right? You have a robot that like could be exactly like a dog, for example, which is probably a bit easier, perhaps, but um that this becomes relevant. And so, I think the consciousness thing was always like, well, you have a perception of self, right? Like you kind
Mhm.
of, what does that even mean, right? Like really, if you break it down, like what the hell is a self? Like, I don't know really, right? Like, does it mean I hear thoughts that I perceive to be my own? Does that mean I have a self? Like, I don't know, right? Um, and so it just really starts going down this rabbit hole of like, you just continue to find definite like descriptions of things that ultimately have another layer of like yeah but you're using another description of something that just like is in of itself not really like objectively tangible, right? um which to me goes like so if I zoom out from that and I start thinking, I'm like there are a lot of things that we accept as science and as true that we can't explain at a very like ground level, right? Like take like, okay, why do like negative neutrons and protons, uh sorry, not neutrons, electrons and protons attract each other, right? Like, negative and positive charge. Oh, well, quarks do this and blah blah
Yeah,
whatever. Okay,
that's
well,
always been fascinating
quarks
for
do
me
that.
too. Yeah.
And so like at some point you're like, well, the energy is, but basically at some point you just end up at like, well, we don't know beyond this point
Yeah,
what does
yeah.
that, right? Like it's just an observed reality. And so we can't explain it. And so I think like that's always what I use in the argument is that this goes a little bit into like your species specific perception or however you called it, but I think this is very much applicable to that as well. That clearly there are things that make the universe work and tick that we don't understand, right? Like, and maybe that's not because there isn't actually some reason for it. It's just not a reason that our species is capable of deducing into
Yeah.
logic. Yeah. And so I think the consciousness is probably something in that realm, that it's something that exists. It's some truth of the matter that we perceive in humans. Um, but we can't actually describe what it is because we don't have the facilities to understand what it actually is. At a very, very like fundamental or but again, it's the same thing. I could say consciousness is a perception of self. Well, what is the self, right?
Yeah.
Like, and to basically you probably have answers that were at some point there's just no answer anymore, right? And so clearly there's something going on that we cannot explain or fathom, not understand it. And I'm not going to sit here and say that means that there's this God, this guy that sits in the sky that does all this stuff. It's not really necessarily what I'm saying, but it means that like there is at least parts of science that our brain is incapable of understanding for whatever reason. And so to some extent, um, that's why I'm always a little bit bearish when there's this sort of idea of like we're just going to completely recreate a human and it's like as like ground up technology, because I'm like, sure, there are things that we can emulate at a very logical layer, right? That these
But
things
it's
can do.
analog.
But
Yeah.
when you get the consciousness, right, and that sort of stuff, which we all kind of agree is part of the human or at least the living organism, uh, uh, it's part of the makeup of it, right? Like you don't have a human without a consciousness; it doesn't exist. That we're ever actually going to be able to create it because we don't get it. We don't understand what it is, right? And so we don't understand what it is, we can't make
Mm,
it.
mm.
And so we're always kind of limited at certain like very core functions. Like we can maybe emulate on the surface that does certain things, but it will never actually be the same because we can't construct something that we don't understand, right? And so that, um, I think that kind of putting a bow, I think, on a lot of like the progress and consciousness and all these sorts of things, right? But the short answer is I don't know what consciousness is. I don't think anybody actually does, right? Other than something that we perceive that we accept to be true, at least in humans and other living organisms to some extent, like animals and whatnot. Um, but yeah, we don't know what it is, and so we probably can't. I think it's unlikely we'll ever actually reconstruct this. So also like with the AI stuff, like, is there consciousness in AI? I don't freaking know because I don't know what consciousness frankly is, right? So like I have no idea. So and the point is that I probably won't ever really understand. So it's a pointless conversation in itself, right? Whether it's in it or not. Um, but so that's I think just we need to be honest with ourselves, right? That there's certain things we're not going to understand, and
Completely.
that's okay. Um, but that's just the reality of the human condition, right? We're not the Almighty, right? As some would call it, right? Like we're not. That's not us. We're not the sky god. It's like there's a reason this concept exists in the first place. Like people are not idiots, right? Like at some point they were like, "There's just crap we can't explain."
Yeah.
Um, perhaps maybe there's some kind of higher entity that's responsible for this. It's not us. So I mean, they're interesting thought experiment comfort like things for sure, right? Because I think it does. If you think about them critically, it will make you more modest, perhaps, about certain things. Because one thing I always worry about is when I see these people in Silicon Valley that think they are the god, right? They are the creator, so to speak, whatever word you want to use for it. Um, but it's kind of just nonsense because I'm sure none of these people could explain to me why positive and negative charges attract each other in a
On a
very like
small hall in a
way
big, big space, like like we
exactly
always forget that, and we're like just
like think about it.